Moments. Moments have defined players' legacies for as long as the NBA has existed, and no moments are more significant than the ones that take place in the NBA Finals. Whether for the better or for the worse, the way these legendary players performed on the game's biggest stage ultimately defined how they were remembered for decades to come. With this in mind, there have been many NBA Finals performances that have been crucial to that specific player's legacy. For example, Allen Iverson's iconic Game 1 performance in the NBA Finals, where he beat the previously undefeated Los Angeles Lakers, sealing the deal with his pull-up jumper and with his famous step-over of Tyronn Lue. Without this game and without this moment, the way we view the legacy of Allen Iverson changes quite dramatically. Other examples would be Kobe Bryant's 5th ring, LeBron James's 3rd ring, and Jerry West's 1st. Let me first elaborate on Kobe Bryant's 5th. Sure, the Mamba had already won 4 championship rings heading into the 2010 season, but 3 of those were with Shaq as the lead star, and the 4th was an easier ring due to Kevin Garnett's season-ending knee injury, which otherwise would have likely resulted in an NBA Finals rematch between the Lakers and the Celtics in 2009. If Kobe lost to the Celtics when he played them again in 2010, then it would have been an 0-2 Finals record against their historic rivals, and the Mamba wouldn't have a championship ring where he was clearly the team's best player and where the Lakers didn't have an easier road to the championship. Not to mention how Kobe's 4 rings would have left him just short of Magic Johnson's total of 5, which would almost certainly eliminate Kobe from consideration of the greatest Laker of all time. Then there's LeBron's ring in 2016. Without this championship over the 73-9 Warriors, look at what he accomplished. He won 2 championships in 4 years on a stacked Miami Heat super team where even LeBron himself had previously predicted at least 8 championships. Then there's the ring in 2020, which was accomplished in the Florida bubble after a huge delay due to the pandemic. And to this day, many people refer to this ring as the Mickey Mouse Championship, trying to invalidate its legitimacy. Without the championship over the highly favored Warriors, LeBron's accomplishments are all basically seen as easy road achievements, and he's almost certainly not in the greatest of all time conversation without this legacy-defining moment. Then there's Jerry West's first and only championship ring in 1972. The logo is also remembered by another nickname, Mr. Clutch. But if he finished with a tragically winless 8-0 Finals record, it's honestly debatable whether or not anyone would still use that nickname today. Although he was never able to lead his Lakers past the superior Boston Celtics, he did end up finally redeeming his legacy a bit when his all-time great 1972 Lakers defeated the New York Knicks in the Finals. Obviously, without this lone championship ring, West would inevitably have more damning narratives about his career as a player. But even with all of these crucial rings considered, I still believe that there's one that stands above them as the most important ring to a player's legacy of all time, and that is Dirk Nowitzki's lone championship ring in 2011. With this ring on his resume, Dirk is viewed today as a Dallas legend and as one of the greatest power forwards of all time, and as the man who conquered a super team when no one expected him to. But what if I told you that without this ring, he would be viewed as a failure, as a choker, and as one of the most underwhelming talents of basketball history? Sounds a bit drastic? Well, I have the memory and the context to explain to you why it's not. Heading into the 2010-2011 season, the perception of Dirk Nowitzki and his legacy was in a much different place. Although younger basketball fans may not know this, the vast majority of Dirk's career was riddled with high expectations followed by disappointment. One of the biggest examples was when Nowitzki and the Mavericks blew a 2-0 series lead to the Miami Heat in the 2006 NBA Finals. Dirk's underwhelming performance was a big reason why they lost the next 4 games straight, as he shot 38.7% from the field during that stretch and an ugly 22.2% from three-point range. Another massive example was when Dirk Nowitzki's Mavericks finished with a franchise record 67 wins at the end of the 2007 regular season. Heading into the playoffs, they seemed poised for revenge, and as if they were ready to win the championship that they thought they should have won the previous season. But then, they were stunningly upset in the first round of the playoffs by the 8th-seeded Golden State Warriors, a Warriors team that finished with 25 less wins throughout the regular season, making it one of the biggest upsets of NBA history. Once again, Nowitzki's terrible inefficiency certainly didn't help, as he shot only 38.3% over the course of the series and a terrible 21.1% from three-point range. This came after he wrapped up his MVP campaign for the regular season, which made his drop-off even more painful. These two are obviously the biggest and most memorable examples of Nowitzki's teams disappointing, but it's also far from the only times it happened. Heading into the 2011 playoffs, the Mavericks had won at least 50 games for the past 11 seasons straight, and 3 of those were 60-win seasons. Yet despite all of that regular season success, they had never won the NBA championship. That is a long trend of giving your fan base high expectations just to end up disappointing them. Most of those disappointments were tied to their often subpar defense in the postseason, which even earned them the nickname the Dallas Mavericks due to the fact that they had no D. And defensive prowess certainly wasn't something that Nowitzki was known for either. It got to a point that no matter how well Dirk and the Mavericks did in the regular season, we all expected them to disappoint in the postseason. Why? Because that's what they always did. That was their track record, and that was their reputation. There was absolutely no reason to expect otherwise, because when we had in the past, they just made a fool out of us over and over again. Heading into the 2011 playoffs, Dirk was a 32-year-old 7-footer who was clearly beginning to slow down athletically, so honestly, this was one of the times that we least expected him to deliver. But we all remember what actually happened. They began by eliminating a solid Trailblazers team in 6 games. Then they swept the defending champion Los Angeles Lakers in the second round. Then they defeated a much younger Oklahoma City Thunder team in the conference finals. And then, as the biggest stunner of them all, Dirk and the Mavericks defeated the Big Three's Miami Heat in 6 games. If it wasn't for this incredible run, Dirk's playoff resume essentially has nothing worth bragging about. He would have been sitting around the top of the list of the greatest talents to never win a championship, and he would be seen as one of the biggest chokers of playoff history. This championship ring literally changed everything for Nowitzki, even to the point that many young fans today don't even realize that this terrible legacy was a very realistic possibility that was just narrowly avoided. I'm not even suggesting that this was a fair and accurate way to view Dirk Nowitzki at this point in his career, because when all things are considered, you realize that he didn't have a tremendous amount of superstar support throughout the vast majority of his prime years. But, regardless of whether or not it was fair for him to be viewed as a choker, by and large, that was the reality of how he was viewed pre-2011 finals. You've heard it, and I've heard it. The idea that players back then were slower, weaker, and smaller than modern-day athletes. Is it somewhat accurate? Probably. Is it also grossly exaggerated? Probably that too. In the past 10 years of modern NBA basketball, the average height of the NBA player is 6 foot 7 inches tall and weighs 220.7 pounds. In the 10 years of the 1980s, the average height was also 6 foot 7 inches tall and the average weight was 207 pounds. So although they stood just as tall side to side to one another, the major difference was the weight of the players at nearly 14 pounds less. Simply put, this difference was usually made up of muscle mass. Modern players have an advantage with modern training methods, eating habits, and fitness routines. Guys in the 80s were simply skinnier, but many of them were still very athletic and had lean muscle. They just overall looked a little less physically imposing than today's players. This has partially led some newer fans to criticize this era when they're looking at some of the most non-threatening and least athletic players of the 80s. They'll say things like the league was packed with part-time plumbers and accountants. I hate it when people say this though, because it's easy to take small samples and condemn an entire era for it. It's almost like when people think of the state of athleticism in 2020, they automatically think of Giannis. And when they think of the state of athleticism in the 90s, they think of Jeff Hornacek. The problem with that is that it's erring on an extreme example, and isn't a proper survey of the athleticism of the league as a whole at that time. Want another example? Picture 20 years from now. People are hating on LeBron James, saying he didn't play in a strong era of real athleticism, and here's their future arguments. How strong is LeBron's era in 2016 when he lost the MVP race to a guy who struggles to dunk a basketball? How strong could that era have been when one of the best players in the league was someone who was consistently overweight? In LeBron's era, he played against plumbers like JJ Redick and Kelly Olynyk.
how weak were the athletes in LeBron's era if a guy who was only 5 foot 9 inches tall could average nearly 30 points per game? Don't you guys see how ridiculous and biased these statements are? Although many of the statements are true to an extent, they're cherry-picking details and acting as if it's the complete picture. They're completely lacking context, but statements like these are usually just emotionally motivated agendas in order to build a negative narrative about a player that they don't like as much as their favorite player. People do this all the time with the 1980s. But when you look around the league in that era as a whole, you see guys who were incredible athletes like Dominique Wilkins, Kenny Skywalker, Michael Jordan, Daryl Dawkins, Charles Barkley, Gerald Wilkins, Julius Erving, Shawn Kemp, Xavier McDaniel, Hakeem Olajuwon, Karl Malone, James Worthy, Tom Chambers, Darrell Griffith, David Thompson, Terrence Stansbury, Clyde Drexler, Larry Nance, Dennis Rodman, Orlando Woolridge, David Robinson, Roy Hinson. Seriously, do I need to keep going? Many people are just too young or weren't watching at that time to know about a lot of the freakishly gifted athletes of the 1980s, just like how 20 to 30 years from now, many people won't know about many of the great athletes we watch in today's game.
I gotta be real with you guys. I have to monitor how much time I spend on social media platforms like Instagram and Twitter, because some of the basketball takes on there are seriously awful for my mental health. The amount of disrespect thrown around to various different generations of basketball is truly astonishing. One of the most common, disrespectful, and ignorant narratives that I constantly see being thrown around is that players in the 70s and 80s were basically just plumbers. Sometimes they'll even go as recent as calling dudes in the 90s plumbers. The idea is that guys like Magic Johnson and Michael Jordan took advantage of a bunch of unathletic, skinny-looking players. I hate this narrative because it's overly simplistic, and it doesn't accurately represent the league as a whole during those eras. So let me tell you what is true. Yes, generally speaking, players in the 80s, for example, didn't look as physically fit as players in today's NBA. This difference in appearance is mostly made up of muscle mass. Today, players' fitness routines are completely different from players in previous generations. Modern players have their own physical trainers. They have advanced fitness routines and training methods and better technology. Today, the average player is 6 foot 7 inches tall and weighs 216 pounds. 40 years ago, the average NBA player was also 6 foot 7 inches tall, but they weighed significantly less at only 205 pounds. I believe the majority of that 11-pound difference is made up of muscle mass. The thing is, although players didn't have as much muscle mass and definition, there were still players all over the league who had tremendous speed and roughly 40-inch vertical leaps. The problem with the differences in build is how people automatically equate this to a lack of athleticism. For example, Kevin Durant weighs about 8 pounds soaking wet, yet you would be crazy to say that he was unathletic. And despite being as skinny as he is, he's one of the greatest players of all time. Michael Jordan is another decent example. Although he put on tons of weight and muscle mass during the early 90s, arguably the best version we ever saw of Jordan was in 1988, when he was still extremely skinny, yet he won the MVP, the Defensive Player of the Year, and he put up the best all-around numbers of his career. This takes us to the modern player who is the focus of this video, Nikola Jokic. The Joker has been hit with this quote unathletic tag constantly throughout his career, as critical analysts and basketball fans continue to make this claim. Sure, he may not be the fastest runner or the greatest leaper, and he doesn't have almost any muscle definition, but he greatly makes up for it with his incredible court vision, with his size and wingspan, with his solid footwork, with his high basketball IQ, with his stamina, and with his efficient shooting all over the court. Jokic isn't close to being the greatest track and field athlete in the game today, but he is the best basketball player in the NBA today. The beauty of the game of basketball is that it's a form of art, and you don't have to be the most athletically gifted player to excel in the sport. You just have to be incredibly skilled and know how to play. If athleticism was the main separating factor between the average players and the great players, then a guy like Shannon Brown would have been dominating the NBA throughout the late 2000s. Some of you may not even know who Shannon Brown is. But if you were a Laker fan during that era, then you definitely do. That guy was providing a jaw-dropping highlight just about every other night. Although he had the speed, strength, and leaping ability to jump out of the gym, he simply lacked the skills of an elite basketball player, and before he reached the age of 30, he couldn't even find a spot on an NBA roster. I'll give another example, this time of an older player. Orlando Woolridge was a remarkable athlete, and honestly, a very quality basketball player. Much better than Shannon Brown, that's for sure. Orlando was a 6'9" small forward who was incredibly strong, with tremendous muscular definition. He was also quick and was one of the highest leapers in the entire league, regularly oohing and awing crowds with his insane displays of athleticism. Fun fact, he was also the first player to ever make an East Bay dunk in the NBA's dunk contest. With that being said, he didn't quite have the overall skills to be one of the best players in the league, as he never made a single NBA All-Star team, and a far less athletic guy like Larry Bird regularly cooked Woolridge almost every time they matched up against each other. Speaking of Larry Bird, I believe he's one of the legends who becomes the most validated by Nikola Jokic's success. Jokic is only 2 inches taller than Bird, but both guys had elite court vision. Both guys were elite rebounders, both guys were fantastic shooters, and both guys were fundamentally sound. Like Jokic, Bird certainly had the size to compete in any era. But from the day he was drafted into the league, Bird was constantly making a fool out of anyone who doubted his basketball abilities. He could handle the basketball, he could misdirect the opponent, he could hit a shot from seemingly anywhere on the court, and he facilitated as if he had eyes in the back of his head. Due to his timeless skills, if Larry Bird played in the league today, I believe he would dominate the Eastern Conference just like he dominated the East in the 1980s. If Nikola Jokic can do it, then so could Larry Bird. Nikola Jokic is a living, breathing example of stereotypical athleticism being extremely overrated in the minds of the basketball community. If I still haven't got my point across, then consider some of the recent events in NBA history. In 2016, a player who struggles to dunk a basketball became the first unanimous MVP in NBA history. In 2017, a player who was only 5'9" tall averaged nearly 30 points per game. In 2018, Kevin Durant won his second straight Finals MVP award, and he was the guy at the draft combine who couldn't even do a single rep of the minimum weight bench press. And over the last 3 years, a player nearly won 3 straight MVPs while looking like he spends more time in his pantry than in the gym. Now let me be clear, my intentions are not to be disrespectful to today's modern players, but rather I'm leveling the playing field between today's players and generations past. No matter which NBA era you look at, you will find guys who were insanely gifted athletes, but just weren't great NBA players. And you'll also find guys who were not very gifted athletically, yet were some of the best players in the game. Being extremely athletic, or at least appearing to be, doesn't automatically give you an advantage over the seemingly less athletically gifted players. This was true in 1963, it was true in 1993, and it's still true in 2023. I'll say it again, basketball is a form of art, and your knowledge, your discipline, and technique is way more crucial than your God-given athleticism. Listen, I don't throw this phrase around much, and I honestly think people probably call each other casuals way more often than is warranted. But if there's one opinion that makes someone look like a casual basketball fan more than anything else, it's when people are quick to belittle an entire generation of basketball players simply because they appear to be, quote, less athletic. Look no further than the man who's ruling the NBA today, building a legacy for himself while reaffirming the legacies of many greats before him. The greatest all-around player of all time. What does this mean exactly? When we're talking about this subject, I think most people mean it in terms of a variety of elite abilities. Is he a top scorer, a top passer, a top rebounder, a top defender, and so on? Usually, when this debate comes up, you'll hear 2 players get mentioned quite a bit: LeBron James and Michael Jordan. Let me make this clear. This video is not intended to be a criticism against either of those players. Both Jordan and LeBron are immensely talented in a variety of ways, and each of those players have a legitimate argument for that title. But the thing is, I think Larry Bird's case is just as strong, but for some reason, he's almost never given that same level of recognition on this particular topic. Now let me break down the main reasons why I think Bird's case is so strong. For one, Larry Bird has no weaknesses in his game. Think about how rare that actually is, even when considering some of the GOAT candidates. It can be argued that Michael Jordan's weakness was his three-point shooting, especially earlier in his career. LeBron James is a below-average free throw shooter. Magic Johnson wasn't a great defensive player. Wilt Chamberlain and Shaquille O'Neal were terrible free throw shooters. In several seasons, Kobe Bryant wasn't very efficient from the field, and Bill Russell was a very limited scorer. On the other hand, Larry Bird was an elite scorer overall. He was tremendously efficient from the field, from three-point range, and from the free throw line. He was an elite rebounder, especially considering his position. He was an elite passer, he was a clutch performer, and he was an NBA All-Defender. I challenge you to find one thing that Larry Bird wasn't good at. The other major reason is Larry was arguably a top 10 player of all time in several major categories. First off, scoring. When you consider the greatest scorers in NBA history and factor in a player's scoring efficiency, Larry Bird simply has to be in that conversation. He had a career scoring average of 24.3, which is only slightly behind the career scoring average of Kobe Bryant. He also has the second most 50-40-90 seasons in NBA history, trailing only Steve Nash, and Nash was never the 25 to 30 points per game player that Bird usually was. Over a 5-year stretch from 1985 to 1989, Larry Bird averaged 28 points on 50-40-90 percentages. That level of sustained scoring efficiency is basically unmatched by the rest of NBA history. So again, he's arguably a top 10 scorer of all time. He's also arguably a top 10 rebounder in NBA history, when you consider the position he played. According to StatMuse, among small forwards, Bird has the 4th highest rebounds per game average in NBA history, at 10.1. The thing is, every other player in the top 8 spots all played in the 1960s, which was easily the most inflated rebounding era in the game's history, and that was due to lower field goal percentages and a faster pace of play. The closest small forward to Larry Bird in rebounds per game who didn't play in the 1960s was Shawn Marion, who wasn't even close to Larry's numbers. He was able to accomplish this thanks to his 6'9" frame, thanks to his all-out play style, and because of his intelligence on the court. In clutch situations, he dominated the boards to an even greater extent. For goodness sake, in the 1984 NBA Finals, Bird averaged 14 rebounds per game over the course of the series, compared to the Lakers' Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who averaged 8.1. In the 1981 Finals, Bird averaged 15.3 rebounds, going toe-to-toe with the legendary rebounder Moses Malone. When you consider the era and the position he played, Bird is not only a top 10 scorer of all time, but he's also a potential top 10 rebounder of all time. Then you have Bird as a passer. He had creativity and court vision that was very nearly on the level of the great Magic Johnson. At times, it looked as if Bird had eyes in the back of his head with some of the passes he was making. Among small forwards, Larry has the second highest assists per game average of all time, ahead of Scottie Pippen and trailing only LeBron James. But unlike LeBron James and Scottie Pippen, Bird's assists per game average actually increased in the postseason. When I recently did a video on the top 10 passers of all time, I had Bird as an honorable mention. And good lord, that created a whole bunch of backlash in the comments section. For me, he's in the 11 to 13 range, but at the very least, we can all agree that he's arguably a top 10 passer. Beyond that, there's three-point shooting. Bird is tied for the most three-point contest victories in NBA history with a total of 3. which he won in consecutive seasons. In the 1980s, he was regularly among the league leaders in both three-point percentage and in three-pointers attempted. He has every kind of three-point shot in his arsenal, as he could hit them while off balance, he could pull up in transition, and he could catch and shoot. Throw in the fact that he was one of the most clutch three-point shooters to ever live, and yeah, at the very least, Bird has an argument for being a top 10 three-point shooter. So to recap, he's arguably a top 10 scorer all time, a top 10 rebounder, a top 10 passer, and a top 10 three-point shooter. Now Bird is not a top 10 defensive player, but without a doubt in my mind, he's an extremely underrated defensive player. One thing he was known for was always giving his best energy and effort on the defensive end. You're going to be hard-pressed to find a substantial amount of footage of Bird being lazy on defense, as his blue-collar, grit-and-grind personality translated seamlessly to the court. Although he wasn't the fastest player on the court, he was extremely quick with his hands, as Bird was regularly among the league leaders in steals per game, as he averaged 1.7 over the course of his career. He was also an above-average shot blocker for his position, as he averaged 0.84 over the course of his career, which is actually a higher blocks per game average than proven defensive small forwards like LeBron James and Kawhi Leonard. Bird has 3 All-Defense Team selections on his resume, and even finished as high as 3rd overall in the Defensive Player of the Year rankings in 1983. If it wasn't for his humility, he would likely be the NBA's record holder for the most steals in a single game, seeing how he got a total of 9 in only 3 quarters against the Utah Jazz in 1985. Despite sitting out the 4th, Bird was just 1 steal shy of the illustrious quadruple-double. I promise, I'm not trying to convince you that he was basically Dennis Rodman on the defensive end. But at the very least, Bird was an elite defensive player, who usually isn't recognized as such by modern fans. Again, to sum this all up, Larry Legend had basically no weakness in his game, while being top tier in many different aspects of the game. This is why I believe he has a formidable case for being the most complete basketball player in NBA history. There are some other candidates that I would consider as well. Guys like Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Kevin Durant, and Hakeem Olajuwon. But at the end of the day, when all things are considered, Bird might just be my ultimate choice.
When people talk about the great power forwards of the early 2000s, 3 all-time great names usually come up, as they should: Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, and Dirk Nowitzki. But one player who rarely gets mentioned who was competing at that elite level at that same position was the all-star Chris Webber, who for a variety of reasons gets overlooked among the great forwards of that era. Today, we're evaluating the legacy, talent, and overall career of Chris Webber, and we'll start as we always do by taking it back to the beginning of his career. Chris was drafted with the 1st overall pick in the 1993 NBA draft by the Orlando Magic, but was then immediately traded to the Golden State Warriors for Penny Hardaway and 3 future first-round picks. His talent earned him the first selection, as he was a quality scorer, a solid ball handler, and could rebound with the best of them, and those skills translated extremely well to the NBA level. With Webber added to the starting lineup, the Warriors became a winning team once again, on their way to the NBA playoffs. They went 50-32 throughout the regular season, and Webber was named that season's Rookie of the Year with averages of 17.5 points, 9.1 rebounds, 3.6 assists, and 2.2 blocks on 55.2% shooting. It was a strong first season that ultimately ended in a sweep to the defending Western Conference champions, the Phoenix Suns. Despite quickly approaching star status with his significant impact, not all was well within the Golden State organization. Head coach of the Warriors Don Nelson and Webber butted heads. Nelson had a history of coaching small ball lineups, so Nelson naturally moved the 6'9" Webber to the center position, which was a position Webber wasn't very comfortable playing. With Chris's ball handling skills, he wanted to be involved in the offense in more ways than simply standing in the paint and waiting for the ball to be dumped down to him. The issues left Webber wanting out of the situation, so he exercised his 1-year escape clause, and the Warriors agreed to a sign-and trade that sent him to the Washington Bullets. The Bullets were a team devoid of talent, and Chris would be a major addition in that aspect. But even though he would put up nice numbers in his first 2 seasons with the team, he also did it in limited time as he dealt with significant injuries, playing in only 69 out of the 164 games. It wasn't until his 3rd season with Washington that Webber had a healthy season and broke out as an all-star. He averaged 20.1 points, 10.3 rebounds, 4.6 assists, and 1.9 blocks on 51.8% shooting. This was good enough to lead them to a 44-38 record and the 8th seed in the playoffs before they were eliminated by Jordan and the Bulls. Thanks to Webber, this was Washington's first playoff appearance in 9 seasons. By the summer of 1998, Webber had established himself as one of the better power forwards the league had to offer. But after failing once again to make a deep postseason run, Washington was ready to commit to a full rebuild and traded Webber to a place where he would settle down and enjoy the prime of his career, the Sacramento Kings. With additional acquisitions of Peja Stojakovic, Vlade Divac, and Jason Williams, Sacramento was quickly building themselves a contender in the Western Conference. Webber would continue to improve his game as he led the league in rebounds in 1999 with 13 per game, which ended Dennis Rodman's streak of 7 straight seasons as the rebounding champion. Chris's prime season came in the 2000 to 2001 campaign, where the 27-year-old put up 27.1 points, 11.1 rebounds, 4.2 assists, and 1.7 blocks on 48.1% shooting. At this point, Webber was legitimately in the conversation of being the best power forward in the entire league. His 27.1 points per game is a higher average than Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, or Dirk Nowitzki have ever achieved. With these incredible numbers, Webber led Sacramento to a 55-27 season as he finished 4th overall in the league MVP race. They would go on to lose in the playoffs to Shaq and Kobe's Lakers for the 2nd straight season, as their rivalry was continuing to heat up. But the following season appeared to be Webber's and the Sacramento Kings' year. As a Lakers fan who hates to admit this, I can say that the 2002 Kings had a beautiful and unselfish style of team basketball, as they had 7 players who averaged double-digit scoring over the course of the season. Webber once again did his part, as he put up solid numbers throughout the season, leading the Kings to a 61-21 record, which was easily the best record in franchise history. After handily beating the Utah Jazz and the Dallas Mavericks in the first 2 rounds, the stage was set for the game's biggest rivals to square off for the 3rd straight season. Lakers, Kings, best of 7. At this point, everyone who followed the NBA closely knew that this was the real NBA championship. The Western Conference was superior in talent to the Eastern Conference, and it didn't matter who represented the East in the finals. Both the Lakers and the Kings would destroy them. Over the series, Webber did lead the Kings in turnovers and made several crucial blunders in critical moments, which I'll touch on more later. But overall, he had a monster series, putting up strong all-around numbers. This would be a classic 7-game series for the ages, but unfortunately, it may also be the most controversial series of NBA history. The Lakers would win this series in overtime of the 7th game, but many people think it shouldn't have even got to that point. Sacramento was leading the series 3-2 when Game 6 had numerous questionable calls throughout the game that was going almost entirely in the Lakers' favor. It seemed just like bad refereeing at the time, but it turns out it was probably much more than just that. Years later, NBA referee Tim Donaghy was convicted and sent to prison for illegal gambling, as he bet on NBA games that he refereed. Donaghy has since said that the league had an agenda to have the Lakers win Game 6. Whether or not you believe this statement is up to you. Based on this information, Chris Webber should be an NBA champion and be known as the man who is the best player on the team that ended the Shaq and Kobe dynasty. This is another reason why Chris Webber's legacy is overlooked, although I don't think it should be. After this point, Webber would continue to be an effective and elite player for several years, but he would begin to deal with more and more injuries and would never quite get as close to the mountaintop as he did with the Kings in 2002. He closed out his career playing with Philadelphia, Detroit, and the Golden State Warriors. Looking at the totality of his career, Webber was a 5-time All-Star, he made 5 All-NBA teams, was the 1994 Rookie of the Year, and was the 1999 Rebounding Champion. Overall, he was a solid scorer, could bang down low, but also had a quality mid-range jumper. He was a terrific rebounder and was one of the best passing big men of his era. In my opinion, Webber had the perfect storm of circumstances for being a great player who gets overlooked in history. For one, he should have been an NBA champion, but he wasn't. Second, he was a bit of a journeyman who spent the majority of his career playing for less prestigious teams. And 3, he didn't play long enough to rank very high on the all-time lists. Not everything about Webber's game was fantastic though. He was a player who was known to make many crucial errors and mistakes when it counted. After all, one of his most famous plays of his career was actually from his college days with the Michigan Wolverines, when he called a timeout in the final moments when his team didn't have any. This resulted in a technical foul, possession going to North Carolina, and ultimately caused his team to lose the national championship game. Some of these mental lapses continued into his basketball career, as he made many costly turnovers, like I alluded to from the 2002 West Finals. And I even remember an instance in the playoffs where he already had a technical foul and was visibly upset and nearly got ejected by picking up his second one when Kobe Bryant tried to calm him down so that he could stay in the game. That's right. His opponent tried to get him to keep his cool so that he could remain in the game for what was, at the time, the biggest game of his life. Regardless of his judgment issues in key moments, Webber was still an overall all-time great at his position. He had a higher career scoring average than Tim Duncan and Kevin Garnett, and he had a higher assist per game average than Duncan, Garnett, and Dirk Nowitzki. I wouldn't rank him higher on the all-time list than Duncan, Dirk, or Garnett, but at the very least, he belongs in that class of great big men.
What if I told you that you could have an experienced point guard who could score and facilitate among the best of them? What if I told you that he was a fantastic two-way player who was a more efficient scorer than even many centers, and who had accolades on both ends of the court, as he was also one of the greatest pickpockets in NBA history? What if I told you that he was the leading floor general for a team who had the argument for the title of the greatest NBA team of all time? If you knew all that, would you want him to be your starting point guard? The player I'm talking about is the legendary Hall of Famer Maurice Cheeks, more commonly referred to as Mo Cheeks. Not only is he underappreciated today, but he was even underappreciated during his era, as Cheeks' career overlapped with the likes of Magic Johnson, Isaiah Thomas, and John Stockton. So it's no wonder that he didn't get his due respect. He did make 4 All-Star teams and 5 All-Defense teams. Famously, he was one of the leaders of the 1983 Philadelphia 76ers, who only lost 1 game in the playoffs on their way to the championship. He was also one of the greatest playoff performers in the history of the league. And to emphasize that, look no further than this insane stat. Mo Cheeks made the NBA playoffs in 13 out of his 15 seasons in the league, and in each and every one of those 13 playoff seasons, his scoring dramatically increased from the regular season. Simply put, Playoff Maurice was a thing. Today's video is pretty straightforward. Although people almost universally agree that these legends are the greatest basketball players to ever live, I still believe there are certain aspects of their game that is very underappreciated. Today, I want to place a spotlight on those underrated aspects, which for one, should have some value for basketball education, but I also think this information can help equip you better when debating your list of the greatest players of all time. So without further ado, let's get into it. First off, Michael Jordan. To me, the most underrated aspect of Michael Jordan's game was definitely his shot blocking. If MJ isn't the greatest shot blocking guard in the history of the game, then he's certainly in the top 3. On defense, Michael was a very sneaky and intelligent player who could read a defense and respond accordingly as the help defender. Combine that with his insane quickness, agility, and leaping ability, and you have the recipe for an all-time great shot-blocking wing. MJ has the most blocks by a guard in a single season, which was a total of 131 in the 87-88 season, and unsurprisingly, that was the season he won the Defensive Player of the Year. Not only is he first on the all-time list, but he's also in the second spot as he blocked 125 shots in the 86-87 season. When people argue between Michael Jordan and LeBron James, this is an aspect that usually goes under the radar. Sure, LeBron certainly has the more famous shot-blocking highlights, but contrary to popular belief, Jordan actually blocked more shots per game over the course of their careers, regardless of the fact that he's 3 inches shorter and plays a perimeter position. Make sure you never overlook Jordan's shot swatting accomplishments when considering who's the most complete player. Next is LeBron James. In my opinion, the most underrated aspect of LeBron's game is certainly his clutch gene. I'm not just talking about buzzer beaters or one-possession shots in the final 30 seconds, but I'm talking about playoff situations where everything was on the line and showing up in a big way. Of course, LeBron has the awful 2011 finals on his resume, but far too many people act like his career ended then and there. Since then, LeBron has been constantly dominating meaningful games in the postseason. This is what he averaged in the 2011 finals, and in his 45 NBA Finals games since then, these are the numbers he's averaged, as he's nearly been an efficient and consistent 30-point triple-double on the game's biggest stage. Throughout his career, LeBron has played a total of 8 Game 7s, and in those games, he's averaged 34.9 points, 9.9 rebounds, and 5.6 assists on 48.7% shooting. With a minimum of 3 Game 7s played, that is the highest Game 7 scoring average in NBA history. In this modern day, if you're still saying that LeBron isn't a clutch player, then someone needs to yank you out of the year 2011. Next is Wilt Chamberlain. The most underrated part of his game was his incredibly skillful scoring. Everybody knows this Goliath-like figure was a remarkable blend of strength and athleticism, as he averaged as high as 50.4 points in the 1960s. But often the misconception that people make is that Chamberlain dominated the game simply using brute force, similar to how Shaq did it in the early 2000s, but to an even more dramatic extent. Although Wilt was certainly capable and would occasionally overpower players, he also had one of the greatest fadeaway jump shots in the history of the game. Imagine Dirk Nowitzki's unstoppable fadeaway, but instead of it coming from a 7-foot player with a 7'3" wingspan, it was coming from a 7'1" player with a 7-foot 8-inch wingspan. That was what Wilt Chamberlain was doing in his prime. Not only is there complete compilation videos of him doing that shot, but there are numerous testimonies of Wilt dominating entire games almost exclusively with his jump shot. Next up, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Just like Michael Jordan, Kareem's most underrated skill was his shot blocking. When it comes to the captain, everyone wants to talk about how he was the NBA's all-time leading scorer for many years, and about his iconic sky hook. But what is often overlooked is the fact that he was one of the greatest rim protectors to ever live, as he was officially a league leader in blocks per game in 4 separate seasons, getting as high as 4.1 in 1976. Not only did Kareem used to be the NBA's all-time leading scorer, but he should be the league's all-time leader in blocked shots as well. The reason for this is because the NBA didn't start tracking blocked shots until the 1973-74 season, which means that the first 4 years of Kareem's career, his blocks did not count towards his total. Over his career, he averaged 199 blocks per season, and that includes his twilight years where he was playing less minutes. So even by a conservative estimate, Kareem presumably would have been the all-time leader over Hakeem Olajuwon. With that being considered, I'm very comfortable suggesting that this is a part of his game that doesn't get enough shine. Next, let's take a look at Magic Johnson, whose most underrated skill was his ability to score at will. Magic was a savant with the basketball, as he's arguably the greatest passer that the game of basketball has ever seen. This was his bread and butter, and he's famous for being the successful, flashy leader of the Lakers' Showtime offense. There's no question that Magic's natural preference was being a distributor. But with that being said, Magic could have been a leading scorer whenever it was necessary. He was very reliable with his back to the basket, as he used his size over the smaller guards to be a fantastic post scorer. He also had a very dependable baby hook shot, which he used frequently throughout his career. Magic had 6 games in his career where he scored at least 40 points, and specifically in the 1987 NBA Finals, he led all players in points, outscoring even the legendary Larry Bird and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, as he averaged 26.2 points over the series while still getting 13 assists per game. The 89-90 season was the first year after Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's retirement, and because of this, Magic had to take on a heavier load as a scorer, and he did that extremely well. In the 1990 postseason, Magic averaged 25.2 points per game, which was the third highest scoring average of all players in those playoffs, trailing only Michael Jordan and Patrick Ewing. If he wasn't so unselfish as a giver, he likely would have been one of the best scorers from the 80s. Of course, we gotta follow up Magic with Larry Bird. Honestly, it's hard for me to pick Bird's most underrated trait between his rebounding and his defense, but I think I'll have to give the slight edge to his defense. Now don't get me wrong, Bird was not a defender on the level of Dennis Rodman or Scottie Pippen. But at the same time, you wouldn't be wrong if you described him as one of the elite defenders of his era. A lot of people make the mistake of assuming Larry was a below-average defender, probably because on the surface level, he looks like a slow and unathletic player, but it couldn't be further from the truth. I would argue that hustle and effort are the most important qualities of an elite defender, and Bird played with both of those attributes every time he set foot on the court. He may not have had the quickest feet, but he had extremely quick hands, as he averaged an extremely impressive 1.7 steals over the course of his career, as he was regularly among the league leaders in steals per game. One of the most impressive performances in Bird's career was in 1985 against the Utah Jazz, when he nearly got a quadruple-double, pouring in 30 points, 12 rebounds, 10 assists, and a whopping 9 steals on 59% shooting. One other key detail, Larry didn't even play in the fourth quarter of that game, because it was a blowout. If Larry had stayed in the game, not only could he have got a quadruple-double, but he may have set the record for the most steals ever in a single NBA game. For his career, Larry made a total of 3 All-Defense teams, and he was 3rd overall in the Defensive Player of the Year voting in 1983. And even the defensively legendary Tim Duncan has never finished higher in the Defensive Player of the Year race than Larry Bird has. So if anyone ever makes it seem like Bird wasn't a good defensive player, quickly educate them on how little they know about basketball in the 80s. Next, let's take a look at Bill Russell. To me, easily the most underrated part of Russell's game was his leaping ability. For some reason, everybody talks about the incredible athleticism of Wilt Chamberlain, yet Bill Russell's jaw-dropping ability becomes somewhat of an afterthought. It's quite insane how 2 of the most athletically gifted centers in NBA history both conveniently played in the 1960s. Some of you may have not seen the clip where Russell is sprinting on a fast break, and then he jumps clear over the opposing defender on his way to converting the basket. This single play is evidence of his world-class leaping ability, and when I say world-class, I'm not being facetious. In 1956, Bill Russell participated in the West Coast Relays high jump competition. In this contest, Bill cleared 6 feet 9.25 inches, which tied him for first place with Charlie Dumas. Russell could have went on to the Olympics that year, but instead, he decided to focus on his basketball career. The man he tied with, Charlie Dumas, went on to win the Olympic gold medal in the high jump competition. Luckily for him, he didn't have the insanely competitive Bill Russell going up against him. At the time, Track and Field News had Russell ranked as the 7th best high jumper in the world, and as the 2nd best high jumper in the United States. All of that absurd athleticism was packed into a 6-foot 10-inch frame. It's no wonder why he won so much. First off, Kobe Bryant. To me, the most underrated aspect of Kobe's game was his playmaking ability. Everybody knows that the Mamba's natural tendency was to shoot a high volume of shots. For goodness sake, even Kobe identified himself as a gunner on numerous occasions. Because of this, many people tend to overlook the Mamba's ability to create opportunities for others, as he was a far better passer than he's usually given credit for. Of the players who played primarily at the shooting guard position, Kobe has the 2nd most assists in NBA history, trailing only James Harden. So it's not like he never passed the ball like many of his critics like to claim. Obviously, Kobe's longevity certainly helped in that department, as he had a 20-year career in the NBA. On several rare instances in Kobe's career, he displayed what he was capable of when he focused primarily on getting his teammates involved. In the early months of the Lakers' 2012 to 2013 season, the Lakers were struggling to find their chemistry and win basketball games. As an attempt to shake up the formula, Kobe was moved to the point guard position for a small stretch of games against Utah, Oklahoma City, and New Orleans. In those 3 games, Kobe put up stat lines of 14 points, 14 assists, and 9 rebounds, and then 21 points, 14 assists, and 9 rebounds, and then 14 points, 11 assists, and 8 rebounds. A more selective Kobe shot 59% from the field over that stretch, and the Lakers won all 3 games. In the post-game interview, he was asked how he would do if he always focused his energy on facilitating, and Kobe basically said that he believes he'd be the best point guard in the game. You'd be correct if you said that Kobe loved shooting the ball way more than he liked passing it, but you'd be wrong if you said that Kobe wasn't a great passer in general. Now let's look at Tim Duncan. If you ask me, the most underrated thing about Tim Duncan was his explosiveness, especially early on in his career. Back in the 2000s, there was this common narrative about the San Antonio Spurs, that they were the most boring team in the NBA. Honestly, it kinda makes sense. They were a small market franchise, they had a relatively limited history up to that point, and even their team was wearing extremely muted colors. On top of all of that, their leading superstar was one of the most quiet and stoic personalities in the entire league, and his nickname was the Big Fundamental. Fundamentals are not known for being flashy or highlight worthy. Instead, they're smooth, methodical, and routine. Nothing about this team screamed box office, and because of this, people have been fooled into thinking that Tim Duncan was not an explosive player in his prime, and that's just simply not the case. Duncan actually had a very quick first step, as he would frequently face up the defender out of the post position, and then beat him to the rim. Sure, he's always been a player who would punish you with his fundamentals, but when he occasionally had to elevate over the top and simply slam on top of you, he could do that too. His speed in general is often slept on, as he was often one of the first players back in transition. Similar to Dirk Nowitzki, this ability declined dramatically as he got older, but don't lose track of the fact that he was one of the more explosive bigs in his prime. Next up is Hakeem Olajuwon. His most underrated ability was certainly his pickpocket skills. When everyone thinks of Hakeem's all-time great defense, they think of his shot blocking. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with that, as he's the NBA's all-time leader in blocked shots. But with that being said, that was only a portion of his amazing defense. Over his career, Hakeem averaged an incredibly impressive 1.7 steals over the course of his career. That is easily the highest career average by a center in NBA history. For perspective, Hakeem averaged more steals in his career than Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, and Draymond Green. You could seriously eliminate Hakeem's 3 to 4 blocks per game, and he would still be considered as an elite defensive player. In 1989, he averaged a whopping 2.6 steals per game. That is a mind-blowing average for a center. Even the great Gary Payton, the man who was known as the Glove for his tremendously great smothering defense, only got that high once in his 17-year career. In fact, in the last 14 years of NBA history, no player has averaged as many steals as Hakeem did in 1989. The last player to average that many steals was Chris Paul in 2009. The man may be known as the Dream, but in every way imaginable, he was known to be a nightmare on defense. Next on my list is Shaquille O'Neal. For me, the most underappreciated aspect of Shaq's game was his stellar footwork. There was a couple different choices for me to choose from. Shaq's passing ability and vision is something that people rarely talk about, but I gotta give the slight edge to his footwork. A lot of people view Shaq as the big, dominating figure who mindlessly bullied players in the paint. Although Shaq certainly imposed his will on smaller defenders, he didn't do it without his fair share of skill. Referees are on the lookout for traveling violations, but it always felt like they kept an eye on Shaq even more critically. Opposing centers often had few ways to defend the Diesel. He was the most dominant force in modern basketball history thanks mostly to his brute strength and size. But you don't get as dominant as he was without skill and knowing how to execute. Next is Steph Curry. To me, the most underrated part of Steph Curry's game is his inside scoring and his ability to finish around the rim. Too many people act like Steph is nothing more than a glorified three-point shooter, and because of this, I've heard many peers say that he wouldn't survive in the 80s or 90s due to the punishing interior basketball. I strongly disagree. What people need to understand is that Steph is one of the best and most efficient inside scorers league-wide. Last season, within 3 feet from the basket, Steph made a remarkable 76% of his shots, and the only few guards who were ahead of him shot the ball significantly less. Even more powerful players like Giannis and LeBron, whose game highly emphasizes on getting to the rim, were only slightly more efficient than Steph Curry was inside of 3 feet. Curry was also more efficient in that zone than taller star players like Luka Doncic and Jason Tatum. His elite ball handling and perimeter shooting allows him to create space on the interior as well. So in a way, his greatest skill on the perimeter allows him to be a stronger threat on other areas of the court as well. Don't get it twisted, Steph is the greatest three-point shooter to ever live, but he's so much more than just that. Lastly, let's take a look at the logo, Jerry West. The man known as Mr. Clutch was one of the greatest scorers of all time, in both the regular season and the postseason. But if you ask me, the most underrated part of his legacy was his defense as a whole. Somehow, West's dynamic two-way dominance is something that often goes below the radar. West wasn't just a quality defensive player, but he was one of the greatest defenders of all time. The man would suffocate opposing guards with his intense on-ball defense, and he was likely the best pickpocket of his era. Unfortunately, most people are not aware of this because blocks and steals were not tracked until his final season in the league. But that season, at the age of 35, he did average 2.6 steals per game, which was the second best overall league-wide. He was also a quality shot blocker for a guard, thanks to his tremendous leaping ability and his ability to read the opposing offense. West officially made 5 all-defense teams in his career, which is already tremendously impressive for a perimeter player. But the thing is, that honor did not exist until West was over the age of 30. If he had all-defense team selections available to him in his 20s, then he likely would have more all-defense team selections than any other guard in NBA history. Throughout the decades, very few players have been able to average 30 points per game while shutting down the opposing team's best player. Jerry West was one of the few who could do that. There have been many dominant big men throughout the years, but one player specifically paved the way for the rest of them. Not only was he the first NBA player to lead his team to a three-peat, but he's often recognized as the first superstar of NBA history. George Lawrence Mikan Jr., the Laker legend whose legacy is worth far more than it's acknowledged for. When we break down his era, his skills, achievements, and talent, where does he rank among the greatest centers to ever play the game? Today, I'll try my best to answer that, and we'll start as we always do, by taking it back to the beginning of his career. George Mikan began his professional basketball career when he signed with the Chicago American Gears in 1946. The 6'10 center quickly became the best player on the team and poured in 16.5 points per game over the course of his rookie season. Especially for his era, he was an incredibly skilled big man who had a strong element of finesse to his game. Not only did he quickly establish himself as one of the league's elite scorers, rebounders, and shot blockers, but he was extremely difficult to defend overall. Not just because of his size, but Mikan was well equipped with an ambidextrous hook shot. In that rookie season, Mikan led his Gears to the World Basketball Tournament where he was eventually named the league's MVP. At the end of his rookie campaign, the owner of the American Gears decided to withdraw his team from the NBL with the intent of creating his own league, which would be known as the Professional Basketball League of America, or PBLA for short. Unfortunately, the league folded after just 1 month, which meant that Mikan and all of his teammates randomly had to be distributed to the other 11 remaining teams in the NBL. As a result, Mikan ended up on the Minneapolis Lakers. It's amazing how these things always seem to work out for the Lakers. In his first season with the Lakers, Mikan averaged 21.3 points per game as he led all players in scoring, was named the league MVP, and won the NBL title. The very next season, Mikan led the league in scoring again, and put up a remarkable 28.3 points per game on 41.6% shooting. That shooting percentage has led many younger basketball fans to criticize his efficiency, but context is needed for that field goal percentage. In the early years of basketball, players were still developing fundamentally sound jump shots, and some have even speculated that the older and poorer quality basketballs contributed to the lower percentages. Whether that's true or not, I'm not so sure, but I do know this. In the 1948-49 season, the league average field goal percentage was 32.7%. When Mikan scored his 28.3 points per game on 41.6% shooting, believe it or not, his 41.6% was actually the second best field goal percentage in the entire league that season. Here's something else to consider. Mikan averaged 28.3 points per game at a time where teams were averaging only 80 points per game. If you adjust that ratio to this modern era, then that would translate to nearly 40 points per game. When Mikan was dominating his era, he was easily the best scorer, he was arguably the most efficient player, he was possibly the greatest rebounder, and he was almost certainly the game's best shot blocker as well. Over the course of the 1949 playoffs, he averaged 30.3 points on 45.9% shooting and 80.2% shooting from the free throw line, and it comes as no surprise that his Lakers won the championship yet again. This was only the beginning of his reign though, as Mikan and the Lakers won the championship in 1950 and then won another 3 straight titles from 1952 to 1954. The reason why the NBA only acknowledges some of his stats and championships is because of the different leagues he played in during his early career, from the NBL, the BAA, and eventually the NBA. But the truth is, if you account for each league he played in, then George Mikan won a ridiculous 7 championships in his first 8 seasons as a professional basketball player. And if the Finals MVP had existed during that era, he certainly would have won all 7 of those as well. That kind of winning dominance from a big man has never been matched by anyone other than the great Bill Russell. Mikan was so dominant that he was instrumental in inspiring numerous rules for the NBA, including the goaltending rule, the widening of the 3-second violation lane from 6 feet to 12 feet, and he's even credited as the player who inspired the invention of the shot clock. The biggest example of that inspiration came on November 22, 1950, when Mikan's Lakers had a 29-game home winning streak heading into that evening. The Fort Wayne Pistons were determined to end that streak by any means necessary, so when the game started, the Pistons played a game of keep away whenever they had possession of the ball. This not only disrupted Mikan's dominant offense, but it also resulted in the lowest scoring game in NBA history, where the Pistons snapped the Lakers' streak in a final score of 19-18. George Mikan tried to carry his Lakers as he scored 15 of the Lakers' 18 points, including all 4 of his team's field goals. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough, and just a few years later, the 24-second shot clock was introduced to the NBA. All in all, he was the leader of one of the greatest yet forgotten dynasties of league history. He was a 7-time champion, won 6 consecutive scoring titles, won at least 2 rebounding titles, since rebounds were not tracked until halfway through his career, and he made 6 All-NBA/BAA teams. Despite a full legacy, Mikan only played until the age of 31, and continuous injuries and numerous broken bones resulted in him retiring earlier than most. The man was known as Mr. Basketball and was not only influential in the progress of the league, but he also inspired many that came after him, like the all-time great Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who said, "He showed everyone that a true big man could develop the agility and skills needed to play basketball." Mikan quickly opened their minds. Now, would his game translate to the modern NBA? I'm not so sure, and if I'm being honest, I don't necessarily think that's a fair comparison to make, considering how the league he played in had so many disadvantages, from the training methods to the equipment, technology, and even the lack of training resources compared to the modern NBA players.
Mikan certainly had the size and athleticism of a modern big, and he definitely dominated his era just about as much as he possibly could have. If we simply adopt the logic that you can only beat who's in front of you, then Mikan is without question one of the greatest centers of all time, one of the greatest Lakers of all time, and certainly one of the greatest basketball players to ever live.
He was one of the most polarizing players of modern history. I'm talking about the 6'7" small forward Carmelo Anthony. He played 19 seasons in the NBA for a variety of teams. But the thing is, he spent the latter parts of his career as a journeyman looking for opportunities to contend for a championship and eventually simply looking for an opportunity to make a roster spot. Because this section of his career lasted so long, many people are unaware of his skills and abilities in his youth. So just how good was Carmelo Anthony in his prime? Today, I'll do my best to answer that, and we'll start as we always do, by taking it back to the beginning of his career. After spending a year at Syracuse, Carmelo Anthony declared for the NBA draft. Heading into the 2003 draft, a young graduating high school student named LeBron James was the hype of the sports world. With that being said, many people had Carmelo on their radar, and a few analysts even predicted that he would end up being better than LeBron James. But make no mistake, basically everyone expected LeBron to be taken with the first overall pick by the Cleveland Cavaliers, and that's exactly what happened. But positioned with the second pick was the contending Detroit Pistons, who made the mistake of picking based on position needs rather than the quality of the talent. They took the 7-foot Serbian Darko Milicic, who ended up being one of the biggest busts in NBA history. Regardless, the Pistons went on to win the championship that season. So Carmelo being drafted by the Pistons remains as one of the greatest what-ifs of basketball history. Instead, in reality, Carmelo was selected with the 3rd overall pick by the Denver Nuggets. This was a Denver team who was coming off of an embarrassing season with the worst record in the NBA at 17-65. At only the age of 19, Melo had his work cut out for him if he was going to turn this franchise around, and he wouldn't waste any time having an immediate impact. Immediately, his fantastic skills were on display, as he had solid footwork, a lethal pull-up jumper, and was quickly establishing himself as one of the premier one-on-one players of the league. In his debut year, he averaged 21 points, 6 rebounds, and 3 assists on nearly 43% shooting from the field. Alongside of the newly acquired Andre Miller, Melo helped the team bounce back from a 17-65 squad to a playoff-bound 43-39 team. Although LeBron was honored as that season's Rookie of the Year, many people still believe that that award should have gone to Carmelo instead. And when you look at their production and the results of the teams next to one another, you can at least make the case that he was robbed of the award. His sophomore season was more of the same. But it wasn't until his 3rd and 4th season where he truly broke out as one of the best players in the game. By the 06-07 season, at only the age of 22, he was putting up averages of 29 points, 6 rebounds, and 4 assists on nearly 48% shooting from the field. He was second in the league in scoring that season, trailing only Kobe Bryant. It was also around this time that people started realizing that not only is Carmelo a near unstoppable player in isolation situations, but he was also one of the most clutch shot makers in the entire league. No, seriously, I don't think most young fans realize how often and how automatic Carmelo was in game-winning situations, as it seemed like he was clutchly closing out fourth quarters every other night during his prime. The reason he was so good in those situations is because Melo was one of the best players ever at getting good looks when he wanted them. As a 6'7" player with size, strength, and sound fundamentals, he was able to score at will and would methodically get to his spots on his timing. Many of the elite players he played against remember this aspect well. For example, on multiple occasions, Kobe Bryant has referred to Melo as the hardest player to guard. To quote the Mamba in 2011, when he was asked who was the most difficult player to guard, he said, "It's Carmelo Anthony, by far. His size and strength, he knows how to use it. he throws his weight around. If you look at some of the other players, LeBron James, Dwyane Wade, and some of these other guys, they're either all the way to the basket or they're long range. But Melo, he can post up, he can finish at the rim, he has a mid-range game, he has a 3-ball game, he can pull up left, he can pull up right, he can step back left, he can step back right. So that gives a lot of options as an offensive player. That wasn't just an opinion of the Mamba, but many star players who were unfortunate enough to defend a prime Melo were asking themselves, how do I stop this guy? Now make no mistake on who Melo was. At his core, this guy was a pure scorer, a flat-out bucket getter. During his time in Denver, he never once averaged at least 4 assists per game. His specialty was making plays for himself, and not necessarily for others. On the other hand, he was never known as anything greater than a subpar defensive player. At the time, the league was filled with great two-way players, like Kobe, LeBron, Wade, Duncan, and Garnett. So whenever the conversation of the best player of the game came up, and someone mentioned Carmelo Anthony, the response was almost always, yeah, but what about defense? Because he was lacking on that end of the court, people never seemed to give him as much respect as the other top scorers in the league. Now, as Melo progressed in his career, the Nuggets organization tried several different experiments to give him a contending supporting cast. And after Andre Miller came Allen Iverson. Although the Melo and Iverson tandem provided plenty of highlights, it also kind of went exactly how we all expected. Both players were extremely ball-dominant scorers, who didn't necessarily complement each other on offense. And obviously, the perimeter defense was a bit of a weak spot. For the first 5 years of Anthony's career, he was eliminated out of the first round of the playoffs. But all of that would soon change with one major acquisition. Early in the 2008 to 2009 regular season, the Nuggets traded Allen Iverson to the Detroit Pistons in return for the former Finals MVP winner, Chauncey Billups. Now Melo had a point guard who operated more like a true floor general, and more appropriately complemented his game. At the end of that regular season, Denver had a 54-28 record, which was good enough for the second seed in the Western Conference playoffs. Everything seemed to be clicking at just the right time. They comfortably eliminated a talented Hornets team in just 5 games. And then, in the semifinals against Dirk Nowitzki and the Mavericks, Melo absolutely exploded, averaging 30 points and 7 rebounds on insane efficiency splits, and his Nuggets convincingly won the series in just 5 games. In the Western Conference Finals was a matchup with the defending West champions, and a team hell-bent on NBA Finals revenge, Kobe Bryant and the Los Angeles Lakers. What ensued was one of the greatest solo battles in playoff history, as Kobe and Carmelo brought the physical intensity while skillfully trading baskets back and forth throughout that 6-game series. After the hard-fought series was over, the Lakers prevailed, and went on to win the NBA championship over the inferior Orlando Magic. I truly believe that if Kobe and the Lakers were not standing in the way, then it would have been Carmelo Anthony and the Denver Nuggets who won the 2009 NBA championship. After that incredible run, the Nuggets would revert back to their old ways, losing in the first round for the foreseeable future. Eventually, Carmelo Anthony did demand a trade specifically to the New York Knicks, and he got his wish. But the results were a bit of a mixed bag. After 2 first-round exits in the first couple of years in New York, they finally seemed to have a squad ready to compete, with weapons like Amari Stoudemire and Tyson Chandler. Seeing the opportunity for a shot at a championship, Melo also had a massive year on an individual level, as he won his first scoring title with an average of 28.7 points per game. This all resulted in them winning 54 games and securing a second seed in the Eastern Conference. But unfortunately, New York's second best player, Stoudemire, was plagued by injuries towards the end of the season. So New York never really had their true opportunity to compete for a championship that season, as they were eliminated in the second round by the Indiana Pacers. Now here's another interesting thing about Carmelo's career. For a while, he was an elite level player. From the 05 to 06 season through the 2013 to 2014 season, Melo averaged about 26 points and 7 rebounds on 55% true shooting. Without question, he was legitimately a top player in the league for about an 8-season stretch. But the thing is, all of that took place before he turned 30 years old. Right about the time Melo turned 30, there was a massive drop-off in his production. To many basketball analysts at the time, Melo didn't seem to care as much about his physical conditioning. Players like LeBron James and Kobe Bryant became obsessive about their conditioning as they got older. But on the other hand, Melo started gaining weight. He visibly looked slower and started lacking consistency. Obviously, as the years went on, Melo declined to the point that his career ended as a journeyman. But what's crazy is that the significant decline started at just the age of 30. So again, we ask the question, how good was a prime Carmelo Anthony? Well, at least for a while, he was considered as one of the best offensive players in the league, and was in the conversation with Kobe Bryant for the title of the most clutch player in the league. But even then, he wasn't without his flaws. His defense was subpar at best. He wasn't a great facilitator, and due to his lack of solid conditioning, his prime didn't last as long as his superstar peers. Because basically the entire second half of his career was on the decline, I think people have forgotten or just never knew how good prime Melo actually was, as he very nearly led the Nuggets to win it all in 2009. And who knows? If Detroit has selected him in 2003, that championship may have came long before that. Since his retirement, Gilbert Arenas has made a name for himself as a podcaster, a YouTuber, and as one of the most highly productive hot take machines in the media. I'm sure we all have various opinions on him as an analyst and as a podcaster, but that's not what this video is about. This video is about enlightening people on the value and legacy of Gilbert Arenas' basketball career. If you listen to Agent Zero talk about himself, you'd probably think he was one of the 75 greatest players of all time. But if you listen to the opinions of people who dislike him as an analyst, then you'd probably be convinced that he was a scrub who was nowhere close to being a legitimate superstar in the NBA. As someone who witnessed the entirety of his basketball career, my goal is to find the middle ground and give an accurate assessment on the quality of Arenas as a basketball player. So without further ado, let's get into it. Heading into the NBA, people didn't have tremendously high expectations for Arenas, as the 6'4" point guard was taken in the second round of the 2001 draft by the Golden State Warriors. His first season was a very modest debut in the league, as he only averaged 10 points on 45% shooting. With that being said, Gilbert is most famous for his time as a Wizard, and he didn't arrive in Washington until his third season in the league. This is where he would begin to establish himself as a legitimate threat in the league. When it comes to his skill set, he was a guy who was truly ahead of his time. If I'm being honest, I think he would be incredibly well suited to be a superstar player in modern 2023 basketball. He had a solid crossover dribble and a lethal pull-up jumper. In a way, I view him as a player who was similar to James Harden, in the sense that he was a volume shooter who loved taking step-back jumpers and who especially loved to take the majority of his shots from three-point distance. Also in a way that's similar to Harden, Gilbert didn't have a very good field goal percentage. But when you combine that with his three-point shooting and his free throw shooting, he actually had a pretty decent true shooting percentage. Similar to an earlier star like Allen Iverson, Arenas was a flat-out gunner, who could shoot you out of a game if he was having an off night, or he could lead you to a blowout victory with one of the most dangerous hot hands in the entire league. A perfect example of that was when he torched Kobe Bryant and the Los Angeles Lakers by scoring 60 points, which is the most points ever scored against a Kobe Bryant-led team. Now during his prime years in Washington, he didn't have any deep postseason runs, and some say that's because Arenas didn't have the most solid supporting cast, which is certainly true, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Arenas was a score-first point guard who would look for his own shot before looking to provide a solid shot for his teammate. I have to bring up the James Harden comparison yet again, But in a way that's similar to Harden, you can only describe Arenas as an average defender at best, and honestly, even that is probably a little too generous. On a more positive note, it would have been interesting to see Arenas in more playoff situations with a more solid supporting cast, because in a way that's similar to Damian Lillard, he was one of the best clutch shot makers in the entire league, who seemingly had limitless range. At his best in 2006, he averaged 29 points, 6 assists, and 3 rebounds on 58.1 true shooting percentage. Later on in the first round of the playoffs, his 5th-seeded Wizards were taking on the 4th-seeded Cavaliers, and what ensued was one of the greatest solo battles in playoff history between Gilbert Arenas and LeBron James. Both players showed up with their best efforts, and Game 5 specifically was an absolute classic, as Arenas dropped 44 points, 5 rebounds, and 4 assists on 58% shooting, while James put up 45 points, 7 rebounds, and 6 assists on 61% shooting. On the series as a whole, Arenas averaged 34, 5, and 5 on 46%, while LeBron averaged 35, 7, and 6 on 51%. Ultimately, it was LeBron's Cavs who won the series in 6 games. If anyone ever asks you to summarize how good Arenas was in his prime, you can simply tell them that he was good enough to go toe-to-toe with a young LeBron James in the playoffs. The following season, Arenas would again have a monstrous regular season, as he averaged 28 points, 6 assists, and 5 rebounds on 42% shooting. His Wizards finished with a 41-41 record, barely squeezing their way into the playoffs. And waiting for them again was LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers. Unfortunately, Gilbert would not be a part of this series though, because with only 7 games left in the regular season, he tore his MCL. Without their leading star, the Wizards were swept by LeBron and the Cavs. This was the beginning of the downward spiral of Gilbert's career, because after the MCL tear at the age of 25, his body would never fully recover and allow him to return to his near 30 points per game form. To add insult to injury, Arenas had his famous weapons incident in December of 2009, where he and his teammate Javaris Crittenton both drew weapons on each other in the Wizards locker room. After pleading guilty to a felony offense of carrying an unlicensed weapon, the reputation of Arenas had taken a major hit. The drama and health issues were taking their toll, and in 2011 he was traded to the Orlando Magic, where he was paired up with an elite Dwight Howard. In theory, this should have been a dominant tandem in the Eastern Conference, but unfortunately, Arenas was just a shell of what he once was, as he only averaged 8 points on 34% shooting in his 49 games with the Magic. After a disastrous finale season with the Grizzlies, he had played his final game in the NBA at just the age of 30. So to recap, Arenas was a 3-time All-Star and he made 3 All-NBA teams. At his best, he was a player who would occasionally outplay the best the game had to offer, like Kobe Bryant and LeBron James. Although he was solid in the passing lanes and averaged a decent amount of steals, he was not a good on-ball defender by any means. Although he had stretches where he was an elite scorer, there's no question that he was a volume scorer, as he shot a career 42.1% from the field. Some of that efficiency begins to balance out when you look at his true shooting percentage. But make no mistake, this guy was a shoot-first point guard in a similar way to a prime Allen Iverson. In his career, he never got past the second round of the playoffs, but you could certainly argue that this fact had more to do with his injuries and a lack of a solid supporting cast, rather than an actual indication of his weaknesses. If you ask me, I believe he was a much better player than a podcaster. But what I will not dispute is that whether it was on the court or off the court, this man has never been accused of being boring. That's for sure. Only 14 players in NBA history have won multiple MVPs throughout their career, and this guy is one of them. Steve John Nash, famously known as the leader of the high-scoring Phoenix Suns in the 2000s. But his MVPs are still some of the most controversial and hotly debated awards of league history, which then begs the question, just how good was Steve Nash really? Today, I'll do my best to answer that, and we'll start as we always do, by taking it back to the beginning of his career. The 6'3" point guard was drafted with the 15th overall pick in the 1996 NBA draft by the Phoenix Suns. There wasn't a tremendous amount of hype surrounding him upon entering the league, as some described him as a poor man's John Stockton. Another reason for his lack of hype was because he was somewhat overshadowed by the overall talent in the 1996 NBA draft, which has a legitimate argument for the claim of the greatest draft class of league history. Nash was going to have to prove himself in order to earn his minutes, a task that would be difficult considering how he spent his first 2 seasons in Phoenix behind great established point guards like Kevin Johnson, Sam Cassell, and Jason Kidd. In his first 2 seasons, he only managed to put up very modest numbers in his few minutes. It wasn't until the summer after the completion of his second season that the Dallas organization recognized his potential and traded for the 24-year-old guard. Nash immediately became a starter for the Mavericks, but his game was still developing slowly to go along with the fact that he was dealing with injuries over the next 2 seasons. It wasn't until his 3rd season with Dallas that Nash began to break out as a premier point guard, as he put up around 15 points and 7 assists on 48.7% shooting. He was decently close to his first 50-40-90 season, something that would go on to become a theme of his career. With his solid form and with his high-arcing jumper, he established himself as one of the most reliable and efficient shooters of the game. Over the next several seasons, his game would slightly improve in Dallas, and with the help of Dirk Nowitzki and Michael Finley, the Big Three Mavericks were consistently making noise in the Western Conference playoffs, making it as far as the West Finals in 2003, where they were eventually eliminated by Tim Duncan's Spurs. Heading into the summer of 2004, Nash had put up solid numbers in his recent years with Dallas, but he wasn't quite in the conversation yet of the best point guards of the entire league. Nash was also 30 years old and entering free agency. Typically, an NBA player's best years are behind him by the time he's reached his 30s, and Mavericks owner Mark Cuban had already committed to pay a significant salary to players like Anton Jamison, Michael Finley, Antoine Walker, and Dirk Nowitzki. Cuban offered Nash a 4-year deal that would pay him $9 million per year, but Phoenix offered him a 6-year deal for $63 million, which Cuban was not willing to match. So it was back to the Phoenix Suns for Nash, who were just coming off of a 29-53 season. This is where the star point guard's career would completely take off, as it was the perfect setting for his skill set and style. The new head coach of the Phoenix Suns was Mike D'Antoni, who loved to play a high-scoring and up-tempo style, which highly emphasizes perimeter shooting. Under D'Antoni, Nash and the Suns became famous for their 7-second offense, where the goal was to take each shot attempt within the first 7 seconds of gaining possession. Transition basketball is where Nash excels, as his ability to make quick decisions significantly improved his assists per game within this offense. With supporting talent like Joe Johnson, Sean Marion, and Amari Stoudemire, Nash led Phoenix to a league-best 62-20 record, which was a 33-win improvement over the previous season. On the year, Nash put up 15.5 points and a league-leading 11.5 assists on remarkable all-around efficiency. With Nash being Phoenix's only major acquisition, he improved the team from the bottom half of the league offensively to the best in the entire league. This impactful performance earned him the 2005 League MVP award. He continued his terrific play all the way into the Western Conference Finals, where they were eventually eliminated by the defensively superior San Antonio Spurs. The following season, Suns star Amari Stoudemire was lost for the season due to a knee injury, and shooting guard Joe Johnson had been traded away in the offseason. So the shorthanded Suns were not expected to be anywhere close to contenders, but that's when Nash showed his ability to make his teammates better, and actually improved upon his MVP numbers from the previous season, as he led his Phoenix Suns to an improbable 54-28 record. He also did it while achieving a 50-40-90 season, which only 8 other players have done in NBA history. More on that later. Thanks to his incredible play, and thanks to the way he led his team to exceed expectations in a tough Western Conference, Nash was named the league's MVP for the 2nd straight season. Somehow, Nash once again pushed his Suns all the way to the Western Conference Finals, where they eventually lost in 6 games to the Dallas Mavericks. But this wouldn't be the last time that Nash would lead his team to be serious contenders. After another impressive regular season and a near third straight MVP award, Nash led his Suns into the postseason with a 61-21 record, and waiting for them in the West semifinals was their rival, the San Antonio Spurs. This series is still considered as one of the great what-ifs of NBA history. Nash was having a great series, and the Suns won the fourth game, which tied the series at 2 games apiece, but unfortunately, it came at a major cost. Late in the fourth game, in a one-possession situation, Robert Horry gives Nash a very hard hip check, which results in an altercation between Raja Bell and Horry, and several players leave the bench. But the altercation between Bell and Horry is not the part that potentially changed the course of the series. Due to the league office being a bit paranoid shortly after the Malice at the Palace, the league had extremely harsh punishments for any players who left the bench during an altercation. Among those players in this specific situation were key members of the Suns roster in Amari Stoudemire and Boris Diaw. For this simple move towards center court, both players were suspended from the crucial 5th game in Phoenix, a game that San Antonio would win, and they would eventually win the series and the championship as well. If these silly suspensions never took place, then Steve Nash may have a championship ring on his resume, but unfortunately, that championship would never come. When we look at the totality of Nash's career, we see that he was an 8-time All-Star, a 7-time All-NBA player, a 5-time assist champion, a 2-time league MVP, and he's currently in 3rd place on the NBA's all-time assist list. He's also among the most efficient players the game has ever seen. He has the 2nd greatest free throw percentage in league history behind only Steph Curry at 90.4%. He also had 4 seasons with 50-40-90 percentages, which is twice as much as the nearest competitor of league history, which is Larry Bird. But wait, it gets even more impressive. Not only does Nash hold the record with 4 50-40-90 seasons, but from the 02-03 season through the 2012-2013 season, Nash averaged 50-40-90 percentages. That means for an entire decade, Nash did what only a handful of players have done for just a single season. It's not like he was a completely perfect player though. Among Nash's weaknesses was his defense, as he was a little too slow with his lateral movement to keep up with the quicker point guards in the league, especially during his days with Phoenix and beyond. With that being said, he's one of those players who would have loved to have played in the modern NBA with all the transition basketball and 3-point shooting. Since his retirement, Nash has since stated that he wished he had shot more 3-pointers during his playing days, and he certainly could have. One of his listed weaknesses on the day he was drafted was the fact that he's a bit too selective with his shots, and that trend continued throughout his NBA career, which played a large part in why he had such incredible efficiency percentages. All in all, Nash is one of the great point guards of league history, and in my opinion, from a team impact standpoint, he certainly earned his 2 MVP awards. The late 80s and early 90s was an era filled with elite point guards who each left their mark on the league. Due to this rich and intense level of competition, some of those players flew under the media radar and were underappreciated when they played, let alone the years after they retired. That brings us to William Mark Price, the 6-foot point guard who spent the majority of his career as a member of the Cleveland Cavaliers. Coming out of Georgia Tech, Price didn't have the highest expectations heading into the league, as he was selected with only the 25th overall pick in the 1986 draft by the Dallas Mavericks. The Mavericks did not feel too enthusiastic about the undersized guard, so they traded Price to the Cleveland Cavaliers for just a 2nd-round pick in the distant 1989 draft, which eventually became a player named Jeff Hodge, and Hodge never went on to play an NBA game. It would take him a bit for him to send a message to the Mavericks, as his rookie season was spent mostly on the bench behind decent guards in John Bagley and Ron Harper. Due to this, he had very modest averages in his rookie campaign, and a young and rebuilding Cavs team finished with only a 31-51 record. Some of his talent was noticed though, so he was given the starting point guard spot to begin the 87-88 season, and he wouldn't disappoint. Now with Price's skills on full display, people could see how he was one of the best ball handlers in the entire league, and was extremely efficient at splitting the double teams and splitting the pick and roll on his way to the basket. He was also an extremely quick guard with a high top speed, yet he never seemed to be out of control thanks to his sound decision making, his high basketball IQ, and thanks to his incredible handle of the basketball. He also immediately made his presence known as one of the best perimeter shooters in the league, as he shot an absurd 48.6% from three-point range in his sophomore season. His ability to facilitate the ball was also noticed and was a skill that would only improve dramatically as the years would go on. He also put up solid averages in his 32 minutes per game and led his Cavs to a much improved winning record of 42-40. His third season would be his historic breakout year and his team's breakout year as well, as the Cavs finished with a strong 57-25 record. This was mostly due to Mark Price's 50-40-90 season, which means he shot north of 50% from the field, 40% from three-point range, and 90% from the free throw line over the course of the season. It's an elite group of only 9 players in NBA history. There's no question that he deserved the majority of the credit for his team's success, as Price led the Cavs in scoring, he led the team in assists, and he led the entire team in efficiency in terms of true shooting percentage. Unfortunately for Mark, another theme of his career would begin in that postseason, as his Cavs were eliminated by the Chicago Bulls in the deciding 5th game thanks to Jordan's iconic buzzer beater. Over the next handful of years, Price's Cavs would be eliminated by the Chicago Bulls dynasty a whopping 5 times, which explains a couple things. 1, why he may have been so underappreciated, and 2, why his Cavs just couldn't get over the hump despite being consistent contenders in the Eastern Conference. The closest he got to the NBA Finals was in the 1992 season, where his Cavs made it all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals, where they pushed Jordan and Pippen's 67-win Bulls to 6 games before they eventually came up short. None of the blame belonged on Mark, as he was a monster that series, leading his team in points and assists while putting up his usual ridiculous efficiency splits. Over the prime of his career, Price was selected to 4 All-Star teams and 4 All-NBA teams, which might not seem like a ton, but when you consider the level of competition he had at the point guard position, it begins to make a lot of sense. One of the more interesting parts about his career was his ACL tear in December of 1990 in a regular season game against the Atlanta Hawks. Some could experience an ACL tear as a career-altering injury, but this was not the case for Mark, as he recovered well and came back even better the following season, going on to make 3 straight All-Star appearances after returning from the injury. I talked about his extremely efficient shooting earlier, but I haven't quite thoroughly explained just how impressive it actually was. Price is a player who would have absolutely loved to have played in the modern NBA, where high-volume three-point shooting is the expectation. He was a fantastic shooter off the dribble, and he had a lethal pull-up jumper in transition. One of my favorite All-Star Game memories was the way he put on a show with his three-point shooting in the 1993 All-Star Weekend, as he not only won the three-point shootout on Saturday night, but he was also sniping away during the All-Star Game, making 6 three-pointers in quick succession, and nearly won the All-Star Game MVP as a result. Only 7 players in NBA history have won the three-point shootout multiple times, and Mark Price is one of those players, as he won the contest in 1993 and 1994. In those contests, he defeated some of the greatest snipers of all time, like Reggie Miller, Craig Hodges, and Steve Kerr. Not only that, but he's one of the most punishing players ever from the charity stripe, as he led the league in free throw percentage a total of 3 times, and he currently sits in 3rd place on the NBA's all-time list of the most efficient free throw shooters, hitting a remarkable 90.4% over the course of his career. In many ways, Price was the model of efficiency at the point guard position, as he not only had a 50-40-90 season under his belt, but he was just a little shy of having a 50-40-90 career, as he shot 47.2% from the field, 40.2% from three-point range, and 90.4% from the free throw line. A couple of skill sets that he's often compared to is Steve Nash's and Steph Curry's, and honestly, I think both of those comparisons are extremely accurate. Another skill I haven't yet mentioned is how Price was solid at moving without the basketball and would often come off screens with just a second to shoot, and would do so with excellent precision, which again is extremely similar to the way Steph Curry plays. Pistons legend Isaiah Thomas had this to say about the Cavaliers' great. Price was one of the greatest shooters I've ever seen. His shot making, his foul shooting, and his speed made him almost unguardable in that era. When you look at Price's career as a whole, you'll see solid numbers and a massive impact on a historically weak franchise. But what's unfortunate is that his career could have stood out much more if his health had lasted longer. Due to accumulating injuries to his feet and knees, Price finished out his final few seasons as a journeyman, playing for the Bullets, the Warriors, and lastly, the Magic, before eventually retiring after the 1998 season at only the age of 34. All in all, to hardcore basketball fans, Price is remembered as one of the all-time great point guards, and as a weapon who was ahead of his time. And to the casual basketball fan, he's easily one of the most underrated and underappreciated players of basketball history. Another way of putting it is that he was the greatest Cavalier of the pre-LeBron James era, as he trails only LeBron on the Cavs' all-time assists and steals list while being 5th in scoring.
Walter Ray Allen. Universally recognized as one of the greatest shooters in league history. But just how good of an overall basketball player was he really? At this point in hindsight, so much of his legacy is wrapped up in one single shot, possibly the most clutch shot in NBA history. But the truth is, he was so much more than just that. And with this video, I would like to dig more into the less documented periods of his career, as we analyze his talent, his accolades, and the impact he left on the game as a whole. So let's start how we always do, by taking it back to the beginning of his career. Ray Allen was selected with the 5th overall pick in the 1996 NBA draft by the Minnesota Timberwolves, but was almost immediately traded to the Milwaukee Bucks for the rights to draft Stephon Marbury. It would be in Milwaukee where the 6'5" shooting guard would begin his journey to the Hall of Fame. In his rookie campaign, he averaged 13.4 points, 4 rebounds, and 2.6 assists on 43% shooting in 30 minutes per game. He also shot 39.3% from three-point range, immediately displaying his sharpshooting upon entering the league. He had plenty more skills than just that though. He had a fantastic and underrated handle, he was great at moving without the basketball, he could shoot off the dribble, and was extremely accurate when contested. And many have already forgotten how he had a sneaky explosiveness when attacking the rim. He even participated in the NBA dunk contest in his rookie season. Despite the 21-year-old's immediate impact, Milwaukee was still a long ways from competing, and finished the season with a 33-49 record. In his second year, Allen and the Bucks took a leap forward as he increased his averages across the board and had numerous standout performances, like in the final game of the regular season in a must-win situation to get into the playoffs. Allen dropped 40 points, 10 rebounds, 4 assists, and 3 steals on 55% shooting. If a 22-year-old did that in today's NBA, social media would be losing its mind. As time went on, Allen and the Bucks continued to grow stronger, as he was an all-star for the first time in his 4th season, but it would be his 5th season where Milwaukee would make some serious noise in the East. That year, he put up 22 points, 5.2 rebounds, 4.6 assists, and 1.5 steals on 48% shooting and 43.3% from distance. With help from teammates like Glenn Robinson and Sam Cassell, the Bucks won 52 games for the second-best record in the Eastern Conference. Allen took his game to another level in that postseason, as they started by beating the Magic in 4 games, and then beat the Hornets in the second round in 7 games. They were heading into the Eastern Finals, and awaiting for them was the league MVP and the top-seeded Philadelphia 76ers. Now everyone remembers Allen Iverson's iconic 2001 postseason, where he offensively carried the 76ers into the NBA Finals. But what everyone forgets is how close Ray Allen was to leading the Bucks to the finals instead. They pushed the 76ers to an epic 7-game series, and in that series, Ray put up a remarkable 27.1 points, 5.4 assists, and 3.3 rebounds on 46.8% shooting. He also shot a ridiculous 51% from three-point range and 97% from the free throw line. This obviously wasn't just a really solid three-point shooter, but Allen was a legitimate superstar, playing like a superstar when the games mattered most in the NBA playoffs. Believe it or not, we still hadn't seen the best of Ray Allen. Unfortunately, this is the best we'd see from this Bucks squad, as the team wasn't clicking as well the following year, and eventually, looking to make major changes, they made a blockbuster trade, sending Allen to the Seattle Supersonics in return for Gary Payton. In Seattle, the now 28-year-old Allen would have to be leaned upon even more offensively, which led his numbers to consistently increase over the next several seasons. He was legitimately asserting himself as one of the best shooting guards in all of the NBA, and in the 05-06 season, he would have a career year from an individual perspective. He put up 25.1 points, 4.3 rebounds, 3.7 assists, and 1.7 steals on 45% shooting and 41.2% from three-point range. In only 78 games, he set the NBA record for the most three-pointers made in a single season with 269. His record has since been broken over a dozen times due to the inflation in three-pointers. But even with that being said, his 269 total is still incredibly impressive even by today's standards. To even further emphasize how impressive his three-point total was, consider the fact that the NBA in 2006 was shooting less than half the amount of three-pointers that are being shot in the current NBA. In other words, 06 Allen would be an absolutely terrifying force if he played in today's game. He simply increased his scoring average the following year, including a monstrous 54, 10 and 5 performance against the Utah Jazz. Unfortunately, shortly after that, his season was cut short by an injury, and he had to have ankle surgery on both ankles, missing the remainder of the 2006 to 2007 season. Although Allen was an all-star in each of his 4 full seasons with the Sonics, they were never able to make it as far as the conference finals, and due to this, the Sonics were ready to head into a complete rebuild by the 2007 offseason. So they traded Allen to the Boston Celtics for a couple players and a lottery pick. Shortly after, the Celtics also acquired Kevin Garnett, forming the iconic Boston Big Three. This is all well known and well documented, but the Celtics went from a 24-win team to a 66-win team after the additions. The offensive production was spread out pretty evenly between the 3 stars. Although Allen's numbers dropped significantly from his days with the Sonics, it was all for the sake of winning, as the Celtics dominated their way to the 2008 championship. One thing Allen definitely displayed during his time with Boston was his natural clutch gene. Time and time again, he hit a game-winning basket or a crucial 3 just when his team needed it. In February of 2010, he became the all-time leader in three-pointers made. He also became the first player in NBA history to make at least 7 three-pointers in multiple finals games. When he joined the Miami Heat in 2012, he was 37 years old, and his best days were clearly behind him. But with that being said, he was still about as reliable of a role player as it gets at that age. Other than the Heat's Big Three, he led Miami in scoring during his time there, and he continued to do what he had done so well throughout his career and hit the big shots when they mattered most. None more famous than the game-tying 3 with 5 seconds left in a must-win Game 6 of the NBA Finals. It literally saved the series, and it's why many people, including myself, recognize it as the most clutch shot in league history. Looking at the totality of his career as a whole, Allen made 10 All-Star teams, 2 All-NBA teams, and he was a 2-time NBA champion. He was a near 20 points per game scorer over the course of his career, and was a deadly 40% from three-point range. That's impressive just for a single season, but for an entire career at his volume of three-point shots is absolutely exceptional. In my opinion, Ray Allen is the ultimate example of how a superstar can age gracefully throughout his basketball career. At one point, he was a developing young star, and then he was the leading superstar of his franchise. And then he embraced his role as the second or third option, and eventually he became the standard of a solid and reliable role player. There was no point in his career where he didn't stand out in some way, shape, or form, regardless of his role. In my opinion, he's one of the top 10 shooting guards of all time, and one of the most clutch shooters the game has ever seen.
One thing I've noticed throughout my years of watching the NBA is that the offensive side of the court is disproportionately celebrated over the defensive end of the court. And I don't believe that any single player is a greater example of that than the all-time great defender, Ben Wallace. But just how good was he really? In a perfect world, how much would he be celebrated? Today, I'll do my best to answer that, but in order to get a more thorough understanding of him, we'll start as we always do, by taking it back to the beginning of his career. The 6'9" Wallace attended college at Virginia Union University, and actually went undrafted in the 1996 NBA Draft. But within a matter of a few years, all 29 NBA teams would be regretting that decision. Wallace was eventually picked up by a mediocre Washington Bullets team, who was in need of some help in the painted area. In his rookie season, he hardly got any opportunities, as he only played 34 games and averaged about 6 minutes of action per game. Washington at least liked him enough to bring him back for a second and third season, and although he did see some progression, it remained slow going. By his third season with the team, he was averaging nearly 27 minutes per game, and although he was usually coming off the bench, he still managed to average about 6 points, 8 rebounds, and 2 blocks per game on 58% shooting. After Washington had missed the playoffs for 3 straight seasons, management was ready to shake things up. So in August of 1999, he was traded to the Orlando Magic. He would start in all 81 games he played that season, but he actually played a fewer 24.2 minutes per game, and had somewhat similar numbers to the previous season. With some remaining limitations on him, Orlando finished with an underwhelming 41-41 record and missed the playoffs. Orlando then decided to make their own big changes. After signing Tracy McGrady to a massive contract, they decided to get him a co-star and traded for the 6'8" All-Star forward Grant Hill. It was this trade for Hill that sent Ben Wallace to the Detroit Pistons, where his legendary career would truly begin. At the time, people were considering this a one-sided trade in favor of the Magic, since McGrady and Hill were seen as a superstar duo who could compete for championships in the Eastern Conference. Well, that wasn't exactly the case, because not only did Hill go on to deal with consistent injuries, but Wallace went on to be much better than Orlando ever imagined. Although Detroit didn't have the overall talent to be a playoff contender just yet, Wallace was more than ready to assert himself as a terrific asset in the league. He started all 80 games he played in the regular season and averaged a career high up to that point 34.5 minutes per game. On the year, he averaged 6.4 points, 13.2 rebounds, 1.3 steals, and 2.3 blocks on 49% shooting. Immediately as a Piston, he established himself as one of the best rebounders and best defensive players in the entire league. With his remarkable strength and athleticism, he really was like a modern Bill Russell, in the sense that he was a team-first player who dominated the boards and the paint defensively. Yet he was not a great scorer by any means. Although he was now on the basketball map in a big way, it wasn't all positive. For example, that first season in Detroit, he shot a historically awful 33.6% from the free throw line. In fact, for his career, Wallace only shot 41.4%. That is literally the worst career free throw percentage in NBA history, and it's not even close. To emphasize just how bad that actually is, consider this. Shaquille O'Neal is basically famous for his horrific free throw shooting. Well, he could come out of retirement and shoot 3,000 more free throws and miss every single one of them, and he would still have a better career free throw percentage than Ben Wallace. Yes, Wallace was a master defensively, but you kind of need to be if you're gonna justify having a roster spot with that kind of foul shooting. In the following season, he would finally have some offensive support, and his Pistons started winning games. Along with that, Wallace led the entire league for the 01-02 season in rebounds per game and blocks per game. Thanks to this incredible effort, he was honored with an all-defensive selection, and he won his first Defensive Player of the Year award, which would soon become a regular occurrence in his career. Now imagine playing 80 games in a season, averaging a league-leading 13 rebounds and 3.5 blocks, winning the Defensive Player of the Year award while your team wins 50 games in the regular season, which was enough to earn the second seed, and you're still not selected as an NBA All-Star that year. If that doesn't tell you that defense isn't appreciated as much as offense, then I don't know what will. Now, in his third season in Detroit is when their incredible championship team finally started to take shape, as they acquired both Chauncey Billups and Richard Hamilton, giving Wallace the offensive support he needed for him to truly shine. For the second straight season, he led the league in rebounds, this time with a monstrous 15.4 per game, which was the highest league-leading average since Dennis Rodman in 1997. On top of that, Wallace averaged 3.2 blocks and 1.4 steals, which helped him win his second straight Defensive Player of the Year award. Finally, he was respected enough to be given an All-Star selection, which was the very first of his career. His Pistons went all the way to the 2003 Eastern Conference Finals before they were swept in 4 games by Jason Kidd and the New Jersey Nets. After acquiring the experienced veteran Rasheed Wallace, the all-time great Pistons were set for their epic run. The 2003-2004 season was supposed to be the year of the Super Team Lakers, led by Shaq, Kobe, Karl Malone, and Gary Payton. But Detroit had something else in mind. As the defensive anchor down low, Wallace set the tone for that team, and that squad went on to be arguably the greatest defensive team in the history of pro basketball. The amount of defensive records they broke in the regular season, and especially the postseason, was utterly astonishing, including the most times holding a team under 90 points, 85 points, 80 points, 75, 70, 65, and 60. They held teams to the lowest points per game average in playoff history, and they had the best defensive rating in playoff history as well. Honestly, I could probably make an entire video about the all-defensive records they broke that season, and the player who was most responsible for that defense was none other than Big Ben. The 2004 Lakers were good enough to be a championship team on most seasons, but this year they ran into the defensive juggernaut that was the Pistons. Although Shaquille O'Neal had a decent final series, averaging 26.6 points per game, that was still far less than what he usually produced in the finals, and the credit for that belonged mostly to Wallace, who was one of the few players in basketball history who was actually as strong as the Diesel, which meant that Shaq couldn't just bully him as much as he wanted to. Not only did the Pistons go on to win that championship series, but they did it in dominating fashion, closing out the super team Lakers in just 5 games. Obviously, this was the absolute pinnacle of Wallace's career, but he was far from done adding to his resume. In his next 2 seasons, he would win the Defensive Player of the Year award yet again, which meant that he won the award a whopping 4 times in just 5 years. His 4 DPOYs is tied for the most in NBA history, alongside of the great Dikembe Mutombo. After starting his career struggling to make the playoffs in few minutes of action, he went on to be a perennial winner with the Detroit Pistons, as he made the Eastern Conference Finals in 4 straight seasons, including 2 trips to the NBA Finals in 2004 and 2005. As his strength and athleticism started to deteriorate with age, so did his defensive impact, and because of that, he ended his career as somewhat of a journeyman, playing in Chicago, Cleveland, and eventually he made his return to Detroit, before eventually retiring at the age of 37. In total, he was a 4-time All-Star, but that was far fewer than what he actually deserved. He made 5 All-NBA teams, 6 All-Defense teams, was a 4-time Defensive Player of the Year, a 2-time rebounds leader, a 1-time blocks leader, and the 2004 NBA champion. Although he was certainly the epitome of a free throw liability, he was also one of the select few greatest defensive players of all time. And honestly, I think he's one of the most underappreciated players of all time, considering how he only made 4 All-Star teams, and considering how long it took for him to go into the Basketball Hall of Fame. The 07 to 08 Boston Celtics, otherwise known as Boston's Big Three, they adamantly won the NBA championship, destroying Kobe Bryant and the Los Angeles Lakers by 39 points in the 6th game of the NBA Finals. For Celtics fans, their championship is extremely memorable. For Lakers fans like myself, it's also extremely memorable, but for all the wrong reasons. The thing is, in the years since, Boston's retired stars continue to run their mouths about their success, as if they were a full-blown dynasty. It's so well known on social media amongst the basketball community that it's basically become a meme at this point. So now this team's success has become somewhat blurry when we look upon it in hindsight. Some now think they're not as good as advertised, while others still believe they're extremely underrated. So seeing that I have vivid memories of this squad and still hate them to this day with a burning passion, how do they stand in my mind among the great teams of league history? Well, for starters, let's take a look back at how that team assembled. The 06 to 07 Boston Celtics were a complete disaster. The team struggled with their chemistry, and thanks to Paul Pierce's injuries that caused him to miss nearly half of the season, they struggled to produce much offense, finishing in the bottom 3 spots of the league. They were a lottery team that finished the regular season with only a 24-58 record. Needless to say, Danny Ainge and the rest of the Celtics upper management were looking to make some major changes heading into that offseason. Their first big move was acquiring the all-time great sharpshooting star, Ray Allen, in a draft day trade. On paper, the tandem of Pierce and Allen made them a dark horse contender in the Eastern Conference. But it was their next move that truly shook the basketball world, as Boston pulled off a blockbuster trade, acquiring the former league MVP, Kevin Garnett. The day this trade went down, I remember telling my father that the Celtics were going to win the NBA championship. Defensively, they were the best team Boston had seen in decades, and they were suffocating their opponents on a nightly basis. On the offensive end, they complemented each other's play styles perfectly, and with Garnett leading the team as the emotional leader, a bond was formed between several veterans who were starving for a championship. They steamrolled the regular season, winning 66 games, which was the most that the franchise had experienced since Larry Bird's MVP seasons. At one point, the Houston Rockets were on a historic 22-game winning streak, where they defeated many of the league's strongest contenders. But it was these Celtics who emphatically put a stop to that streak, as they went into the Rockets building and destroyed them by 20 points, holding Houston to only 74 points on the night. The postseason would prove to be tough for Boston, as each of their 4 playoff series went to at least 6 games. But when it was all said and done, they ultimately prevailed as champions, cementing themselves among the great teams of Celtics history. It was truly the perfect time for these 3 stars to come together and succeed, as they were each now in their early 30s and just starting to exit the prime of their careers. The thing is, due to the fact that they were starting to show their age, and the fact that they only won a single championship, many people view this team as a bit of a one-hit wonder. Some say things like they had the opportunity and seized the opportunity, but ultimately the squad wasn't good enough to win multiple championships. Therefore, they can't be considered among the great teams of basketball history. And let me be clear, this is a narrative that I strongly disagree with. I believe this Boston team was on their way to being a dynasty, but unfortunately, they ran into disastrous circumstances that were out of their control. To begin the 08-09 season, Boston looked like they were poised to repeat as champions and were once again crushing the league defensively. Unfortunately for Boston, 2/3 into the regular season, the Celtics' reigning Defensive Player of the Year and arguably their best player, Kevin Garnett, suffered a season-ending knee injury. Without KG available for the playoffs, Boston's championship hopes basically immediately went up in smoke. At the time of Garnett's injury, Boston was tied for the best record in the Eastern Conference, and regardless of the fact that arguably their best player missed 25 games of the regular season, they still finished with a 62-20 record. I understand that Kobe and the Lakers won the championship that season, but my feeling throughout that regular season was that Boston was still the better team, and that Los Angeles wasn't quite ready for their physicality, at least until they would acquire Artest in the following offseason. So to recap, Boston emphatically won in 2008, and I personally believe that it hadn't been for Garnett's injury, they would have won again in 2009. As we all know, the Lakers and Celtics had their highly anticipated finals rematch in 2010, and the series went to a hard-fought 7th game where the Lakers narrowly prevailed by a final score of 83-79. But keep in mind, Boston's starting center Kendrick Perkins went down with a season-ending injury in Game 6 and was dearly missed in the 7th and deciding game. Now before you laugh because it's quote, only Kendrick Perkins, ask any Celtics fan who was closely watching at that point, and they'll tell you about his value to the team. Perkins was Boston's starting center and had the best year of his career, averaging close to a double-double and 1.7 blocks in only 27 minutes per game. Not only that, but in many ways, he was the team's enforcer physically. Perkins was the kind of guy who would make you think twice before you attack the basket, and he had a significant impact on the game in terms of the team's interior defense and rebounding. Now with that in mind, consider how Game 7 played out in the absence of Perkins. Of all games in the series, no game had a bigger deficit in rebounding than in Game 7, and that advantage went to the Lakers. Kobe Bryant had his playoff season high with 15 rebounds, and Pau Gasol put up a monstrous 18 rebounds. Not only did the Lakers destroy the Celtics on the boards, but they also demolished them with the points in the paint, and both of these areas is where Perkins usually had a significant impact. When you consider the fact that this came down to the final few possessions, you realize that a healthy Perkins likely would have been the winning touch for Boston. Now, let's recap again. Boston won in 2008. An injury possibly kept them from winning in 2009, and an injury likely kept them from winning in 2010. This team had a very realistic shot at three-peating in their first few seasons together and becoming a dynasty. After that, the Celtics stars were in their mid-30s and had officially begun their decline, and the Big Three's Miami Heat eliminated them in back-to-back seasons from the playoffs. Now, the point of this video isn't about making excuses for Boston, because in reality, conditioning and remaining healthy for the playoffs is something that has always been a factor for winning championships. But the point I'm trying to make is that the Big Three Celtics were much better than their single championship would indicate. They had the makings of a dynasty and were talented enough to do it, but when it came to injuries and the timing of them, they simply had an extreme case of bad luck. This is the reason why I don't have a problem with the Big Three Celtics gloating about their lone 2008 championship, because I truly believe that they were every bit as good as they think they were. It was three starving superstars coming together, working together, achieving basketball immortality, and they added to the legacy of one of the most prestigious franchises of NBA history.
When we talk about the most underrated players of NBA history, there are plenty of names to consider, but one that certainly doesn't get enough attention is Kevin Maurice Johnson. He played 12 seasons in the NBA, mostly as a member of the Phoenix Suns, and in that time, he left an impact on that fan base that lasts to this very day. But as for the NBA community as a whole, many have already forgotten just how talented this guy was. So to gain a proper appreciation for his legacy, we'll start as we always do, by taking it back to the beginning of his career. Kevin Johnson was drafted with the 7th overall pick in the 1987 NBA draft by the Cleveland Cavaliers. The 6'1" guard was acquired by the Cavs with the intent of competing with a young Mark Price for the starting point guard spot. After 52 games in his rookie season, Johnson had lost the battle of the starting position to Price, which resulted in the Cavs trading Johnson to the Phoenix Suns, where his minutes would dramatically increase. As a 22-year-old in his sophomore season, which was his first full season with the Suns, he put up remarkable numbers of 20.4 points, 12.2 assists, 4.2 rebounds, and 1.7 steals on 50.5% shooting, which was good enough for him to be awarded the league's Most Improved Player award. As one of the team leaders, this amazing year-long performance propelled the Suns to a 55-27 record and into the Western Conference Finals, where they were eventually eliminated by the Los Angeles Lakers. That was far from Kevin's fault though, as he put up over 23 points and 12 assists in the playoffs as well. In this year, which again was only his second season, he became one of only 3 players in NBA history to have averaged over 20 points and over 12 assists in the same season. Kevin's incredible breakout into the NBA was powered by his many talents. He was a slasher who was fantastic at finishing around the rim and capable of consistently finishing over defenders a foot taller than him. He was a great ball handler, but he was also an elite passer whose all-time great vision and facilitating have been somewhat lost and forgotten among the NBA community over time. Kevin is one of those rare stars whose prime actually occurred in his early 20s. From 1989 to 1992, Johnson was one of the best point guards in the entire league, averaging 21.2 points, 11.1 assists, 3.8 rebounds, and 1.6 steals on 50% shooting. Compare that 4-year stretch to a 4-season stretch of Magic Johnson's career in which he won 2 championships, and we begin to gain a perspective on just how impressive Kevin was during that time in his career. In 3 of those seasons, Kevin consecutively averaged at least 20 points and 10 assists. He's one of only 4 players in NBA history to average at least 20 points and 10 assists for 3 straight seasons. Russell Westbrook, Isaiah Thomas, and Oscar Robertson are the only other 3 players who accomplished the feat. He was consistently leading the Suns to over 50-win seasons, but they were repeatedly coming up short in the second round or conference finals. That was until the summer of 1992 when they acquired Charles Barkley in a trade from the Philadelphia 76ers. The combination of Barkley, Johnson, and Dan Marley dominated the Western Conference. With that being said, in October, early into the season, Johnson suffered a sports hernia, and what would be an ongoing issue later into his career. Regardless, he helped lead the team for most of the regular season, on their way to a 62-20 record, which was the best record in the NBA, and a trip to the NBA Finals where they would face Jordan, Pippen, and the Chicago Bulls. They pushed Chicago to 6 games with all of their stars playing up to their usual standards. But Jordan and the Bulls were ultimately too much, adding Kevin Johnson to the long list of players who would have been an NBA champion if Jordan hadn't gotten in the way. Heading into the next season, Johnson proved once again that as good as he is in the regular season, he's usually even better in the playoffs. After winning 56 games in the regular season, Johnson raised his game in the playoffs, averaging 26.6 points, 9.6 assists, and 3.5 rebounds on 45.8% shooting. The very next year, in the 1995 playoffs, Johnson averaged 24, 9, and 4 on an incredible 57.3% shooting, which included epic performances against the eventual champion Houston Rockets. In Game 4, he dropped 43 points, 9 assists, 6 rebounds, and 3 steals on 18 of 24 shooting. And in the deciding 7th game, he added 46 points and 10 assists, which ultimately was just one basket short of defeating Hakeem and the Rockets. People correctly remember that Charles Barkley was the best player on the Suns during the majority of his career there. But many have forgotten, or just never realized, that there were some instances, like this series against the Rockets, where Kevin legitimately looked like the best player on the court. Unfortunately, Johnson's hernias and general injuries were beginning to catch up with him, as he missed a total of 109 regular season games during his 4 seasons with Charles Barkley as a teammate. At the end of the 1998 season, Kevin's health had declined to such a point where he was ready to retire at the young age of 32. Kevin didn't have a very long career by great point guard standards, and this is a major reason why you don't see him ranked very high on the all-time lists. Looking back at the totality of his career, he averaged 17.9 points, 9.1 assists, 3.3 rebounds, and 1.5 steals on 49.3% shooting, which is tremendously accurate by point guard standards. He was a 3-time All-Star, made 5 All-NBA teams, and other than his rookie season, Johnson made the playoffs in every single year of his career.
So you all know this guy. Many know him as the famous Meta World Peace. You know what? I'm talking about how good this guy was while he was Ron Artest, so I think I'm just going to call him that in this video. And within that time frame, while he was Ron Artest, lies the great player whose talent has been somewhat lost in NBA history. So let's start by taking it back to the beginning of his career. Ron Artest was drafted with the 16th overall pick in the 1999 NBA draft by the Chicago Bulls. He was entering a Bulls franchise that was still struggling to rebuild after their dynasty of the 90s had disassembled. As the 16th overall pick, there was optimism that he would be a quality rotation player, but he certainly didn't have star expectations surrounding him. As a 20-year-old rookie, the 6'6" small forward had a quality debut season, as he averaged 12 points, 4.3 rebounds, 2.8 assists, and 1.7 steals on 40.7% shooting. He also revealed himself to be a solid on-ball defender, who brought energy and intensity in all of his minutes. The combination of his offensive production and of his defensive presence was enough for him to make the NBA's all-rookie team. Regardless, the Bulls franchise was still nowhere close to competing, as they finished the regular season with a terrible 17-65 record. His second season in the league was more of the same, as he put up similar numbers, but the Bulls were still among the worst teams in the league. As he was just into his 3rd year, Chicago was desperate to shake up their roster to become competitive once again, so they traded Artest in a 6-player deal to the Indiana Pacers. This is where he would begin to break out as a star, as his minutes would increase and as his skills would improve on the court. We had already seen him display his strength and tenacity, but with the Pacers, he would begin to display his ability to handle the ball and to be a leading scorer, and even close out games with this clutch play. In the 2003 to 2004 season, he experienced his first year as an NBA All-Star behind averages of 18.3 points, 5.3 rebounds, 3.7 assists, and 2.1 steals on 42% shooting. What he's most famous for, though, was his all-time great defense, and in that area, 2004 may have been his greatest season, as he was named the league's Defensive Player of the Year. He was a major cog in that very elite system, with teammates like Jermaine O'Neal, Al Harrington, and Reggie Miller. With Artest's solid production leading the way, this Pacers unit won 61 games, which was the best record in the entire NBA. They comfortably won the first 2 rounds of the playoffs, but ultimately lost in the Eastern Conference Finals in 6 games to the perennial contender, the Detroit Pistons. Although this wasn't their year, the Pistons were getting better, and so was Ron Artest. With key additions like Steven Jackson in the offseason, it appeared as if the 61-win Indiana Pacers were prepared to be even better, and possibly win their first ever NBA championship.
7 games into the 2004-2005 season, and a 25-year-old Ron Artest is playing not just like the best defender in the league, but as an elite scorer as well, as he averaged 24.6 points, 6.4 rebounds, 3.1 assists, and 1.7 steals on 49.6% shooting, and an extremely lethal 41.2% from three-point range. Again, this was only the first 7 games of the year, so were these numbers sustainable for an entire season for Artest? Probably not to that extent, but it was clear that his confidence was building on both sides of the court as he was playing his best basketball. But that's when the infamous Malice at the Palace happened. Artest had several incidents up to that moment that brought his character into question, but when the drink was thrown and he ran into the stands and started punching people, his career and legacy would change forever. Because of the incident, Ron was suspended for the remaining 73 games of the season, and Steven Jackson was suspended for 55 games. And just like that, the 2005 Pacers championship hopes went up in flames. Despite the absence of Artest, the Pacers still made it to the second round before being eliminated once again by Detroit. In total, Artest missed 86 games, which is the longest suspension for an on-court incident in NBA history. By January of 2006, Artest was traded to the Sacramento Kings for Peja Stojakovic. Despite concerns about Artest's explosive personality, he actually fit very well with that Sacramento group and pushed them back into the playoff picture, as they went 14-5 immediately after acquiring the small forward. He also made first-team All-Defense once again that season. Ron spent 3 seasons with the Kings, averaging as high as 20 points per game, while continuing to be arguably the best wing defender the game had to offer. But at the end of that 3rd season, Sacramento committed to the rebuilding process, and traded Artest to the Houston Rockets, where he would be joining Tracy McGrady and Yao Ming in what appeared to be the formation of a new super team in the Western Conference. Unfortunately, injuries were a consistent issue for this Rockets team, as McGrady's season was done due to an injury after only 35 games played. Artest adequately filled the scoring void left by McGrady, and he led the Rockets to a 53-win season and a 5th seed in the playoffs. After defeating the Blazers in 6 games, the Rockets were matched up against Kobe and the 65-win Los Angeles Lakers. With the absence of McGrady, this was a series that the Lakers were expected to handle easily, but even without T-Mac, and even after losing Yao Ming for the series in Game 3, Ron Artest still led Houston to push the Lakers to a hard-fought 7-game series, which was the closest anyone came to beating the Lakers in that championship run. Along with the Pacers in 2005, this was the second major what-if scenario in Ron's career that potentially ruined a chance at a championship ring. But his fortunes would soon change as he was signed by the defending champion Lakers the following season. It's easy to remember the 2010 champion Lakers for the impacts of Kobe Bryant and Pau Gasol, but the player who had a star-level impact who often goes underappreciated is none other than Ron Artest. One of the biggest weaknesses of the 2008 Lakers, who failed to beat the Big Three Celtics in the finals, was their lack of intensity and physicality in comparison to the Celtics. Kobe had essentially said this as well, but Artest was the Lakers' answer to this weakness, as he made them stronger on the boards, he made them tougher physically, and even tougher mentally. Not only was he one of the major factors in defeating the Celtics in the 2010 finals, but Artest also had numerous moments where he came up clutch leading up to the finals, like in Game 5 of the Western Conference Finals, when his rebound and putback off of Kobe Bryant's miss won the game at the buzzer. He followed up that performance with a 25-point game to help the Lakers win the clincher in Game 6. From this point on in his career, he was known as an NBA champion and would soon change his name to the famous Meta World Peace. But it was also around that time where he became just a small contributing role player who had lost much of his speed and a bit of his defensive edge. Looking back at the totality of his career, Meta made 4 All-Defense teams, 1 All-Star team, won the Defensive Player of the Year award, is an NBA champion, and is still waiting for his Hall of Fame selection. Now,
Dwyane Tyrone Wade. This 6'4" shooting guard was famously nicknamed Flash, and for good reason, as he was remarkably dynamic and a fast superstar during his prime. But just how good was he really? Some think Wade is a top 3 shooting guard in NBA history, while others think that that's way overblown. Lately, there's been a debate on who's the greater 2 guard, James Harden or Dwyane Wade. So where do I stand on all of this? I vividly remember the ups and downs of Wade's career, so I'll do my best to articulate his greatness during his playing days, compared to how he's generally perceived in the modern day. So without further ado, let's get into it. Dwyane Wade was selected in the 2003 NBA draft with the 5th overall pick by the Miami Heat. Sure, he was fully expected to be a talented player within the league, but at the time, almost all of the draft hype and excitement was centered around LeBron James and Carmelo Anthony. With that being said, Wade wouldn't take very long to start putting his name on the map. Many people never realized this, but Wade actually played his rookie season as the starting point guard for the Heat, as traditional shooting guard Eddie Jones was operating as his fellow backcourt teammate. As a 22-year-old, Wade had a solid rookie season as he averaged 16 points, 4.5 assists, and 4 rebounds on 46.5% shooting. It is worth mentioning that his assist-to-turnover ratio wasn't all that great, which was one of the first major indicators that he was likely out of position by starting at point guard. Fortunately, Miami made the adjustment, as he was then starting as shooting guard for his sophomore season. But that wasn't the only major change for the Miami Heat in Wade's second year. In an absolute blockbuster trade, the Heat acquired Shaquille O'Neal from the Los Angeles Lakers, solidifying a contending tandem in Miami. Right as the Diesel arrived, Wade conveniently took his game to the next level, as he put up averages of 24, 7, and 5 in his second year in the league. Now the speed and explosiveness of Wade was fully on display, as he was quickly putting everyone on notice that he was one of the best slashers in the game. Along with that, Wade began to stand out defensively, as he's one of the greatest shot-blocking guards in the history of the NBA, right there with Michael Jordan. In fact, Wade has the most blocked shots in NBA history by any player who was 6'4" or shorter, and honestly, it isn't even close, as the nearest defender is the Celtics Hall of Famer Dennis Johnson, who was behind Wade by more than 200 blocks. For his career, Wade made a total of 3 All-Defense teams, and frankly, this is one of the biggest reasons why I believe the comparisons to James Harden are so insane, because Wade was an all-time great two-way player, while Harden is completely a one-way player, who isn't even elite offensively in the postseason. On the other hand, the postseason is where Wade made a name for himself, and earned the respect of the basketball world. After nearly reaching the NBA Finals in 2005, Wade and the Heat broke through in 2006, squaring off with Dirk Nowitzki and the Dallas Mavericks. After falling behind 0-2 in the series, Wade went on an absolute tear, leading the Heat to win the next 4 games straight, with some of the greatest finals performances of league history. Now, many claim that this series was rigged, due to the insane amount of free throws that Wade shot throughout the series, especially in Game 5, where Wade alone took as many free throws as the entire Mavericks team. With that being said, there is the argument that Wade was simply the most aggressive player on the court, and his constant driving to the basket warranted that many free throw attempts. Regardless of where you stand on this topic, it's indisputable that Wade took his game to the next level when the games mattered the most, and because of this, he was rewarded with his first and only Finals MVP of his career. This was obviously the height of Wade's career as a superstar, but what many people forget is that things were quite rough for him after this point for a couple of seasons. Starting in the 06-07 season, Wade started having serious shoulder injuries. After he dislocated his shoulder in February of 2007, it would never stop to be a reoccurring issue that would flare up if he wasn't careful. On top of that, his knee started to become an issue as well, which began to hinder some of his quickness and explosiveness. Following the championship run in 2006, his career turned into a bit of a roller coaster, as he was clearly one of the best players in the league, but he was also missing a significant amount of each season, thanks to his shoulder issues and his knee surgeries. Many people believe these injuries kept Wade from taking his career to the next level, but no one believes that more than Dwyane Wade himself, who was on record saying that he would have been in the GOAT conversation if it wasn't for the injuries. After some turmoil, Wade finally had a mostly healthy year, which was the 08-09 regular season, and on an individual level, it was almost certainly the greatest season of his career, as he averaged a league-leading 30 points, 7 rebounds, 5 assists, and 2 steals on 49% shooting. With a subpar supporting cast, Wade was able to lead his team to a playoff berth, And although LeBron James won the regular season MVP that year, many people believed that it should have gone to Wade. Although he had already pushed through some career-altering injuries, Flash displayed some of his best abilities this season. Many people have seemed to have forgotten just how great Wade was when it came to finishing around the rim. Nowadays, a lot of people argue whether Michael Jordan or Kyrie Irving have the greatest layup package of all time, but Wade certainly belongs in that conversation, as his acrobatic conversions were basically a nightly occurrence in his prime. With Shaq's departure long in the past, and with just a mediocre supporting cast, Wade wouldn't be competing for championships again until the 2010 to 2011 season. That was when one of the most famous super teams in NBA history took shape. The Big Three Heat of Wade, LeBron James, and Chris Bosh took the basketball world by storm and had championship expectations immediately thrust upon them. Although they got off to a slow start in the regular season, they eventually hit their stride and made it all the way to the 2011 NBA Finals in their first year together as teammates. Now you all know what happened in those 2011 Finals. Dirk Nowitzki and the Dallas Mavericks shockingly upset the Big Three Heat, while LeBron James had one of the worst playoff series of his entire career. But here's the thing, guess who was easily the best player on the court during that series? It obviously wasn't LeBron, and regardless of the fact that he was the Finals MVP, it wasn't Dirk Nowitzki either. The player who stood out with the best individual numbers was clearly Dwyane Wade. And if LeBron James had just had a regular performance by his standards, then Dwyane Wade would have 4 rings and 2 Finals MVPs in his career, rather than 3 and 1. This was the only season where it was a debate on whether this was Wade's team or LeBron's. After that, the Heat went on to win 2 championships in the next 3 years, as they made it all the way to the NBA Finals in all 4 years of the Big Three Heat's existence. Although Wade played a part in the franchise record 27-game winning streak, and although he won 2 championships as a teammate of LeBron, there was no question that Wade was the second best player on the team at that point in his career. After LeBron James left in free agency to return to Cleveland, Wade was able to remain somewhat competitive, as he was about a 20 points per game scorer for 3 seasons afterwards. But at that point, it was rather clear that Wade's top 10 player days were long behind him, and in 2019, at the age of 37, he decided to call it quits, retiring comfortably as one of the greatest 2 guards that the league has ever seen. In the totality of his career, he was a 3-time NBA champion, the 2006 Finals MVP, a 13-time All-Star, he made 8 All-NBA teams, 3 All-Defense teams, was the 2009 scoring champion, and is one of the 75 greatest players of all time. So in conclusion, just how good was Dwyane Wade really? Well, if I'm being honest, I feel like Wade had a bit of a weird career. Arguably, the very peak of his career happened in only his 3rd season, and I really felt like his prime didn't last very long, because throughout his mid to late 20s, he was on and off of the basketball court with some serious career-altering injuries. With that being said, I definitely don't agree with Wade that he would have been in the GOAT conversation without the injuries. I think that's a bit too much. But at the very least, maybe the gap between him and Kobe wouldn't be as significant. Regardless, he's easily my choice as the 3rd greatest shooting guard of all time. And the recent comparisons to James Harden are straight up disrespectful. Wade is clearly out of Harden's league, simply because postseason performances matter, and this thing called defense exists. Dwight David Howard. This 6'10 center remains as one of the most highly debated former All-Stars that the league has ever seen. Some believe he was overhyped and overrated, and some think he was one of the greatest centers of all time. When it comes to this player, there seems to be no happy medium, as everyone continues to take extreme stances on his talent and legacy. So where do I stand? Just how good was Dwight Howard really? As someone who witnessed the various stages of his career, I'll do my best to answer that, but as usual with this series, let's take it back to the very beginning of his career. In 2004, Dwight Howard was selected with the 1st overall pick in the NBA draft by the Orlando Magic. He was a hyped prospect who decided to skip college and go directly to the NBA thanks to the influence of his childhood role model, Kevin Garnett. Many of the players who entered the NBA directly out of high school often struggled to have a productive impact in their first couple seasons in the league. But this wasn't the case for Howard. Even as a 19-year-old, he already had a stronger and more athletic basketball body than most of the players in the league at that time. The Magic team that he joined only won 21 games before the arrival of Howard, and in his rookie season, he helped improve the team by 15 wins. In his rookie year, he put up 12 points, 10 rebounds, and 1.7 blocks on 52% shooting. Sure, that might sound tame relatively, but you have to remember the context that this was a player straight out of high school. In that rookie campaign, Dwight became the youngest player to ever average a double-double, and he also became the youngest player to have averaged at least 10 rebounds in a season. But obviously, that's not the best we'd see from Howard. Over the next few years, his abilities would continue to improve, as he developed into arguably the best combination of power and athleticism in the NBA at that time. By the 2008 to 2009 season, Howard had officially reached his prime, as he was scoring 20 points, snagging 14 rebounds, and 3 blocks on 57% shooting. He was a league-leading rebounder, getting at least 20 rebounds 10 times throughout the regular season. But his greatest gift was likely his all-time great rim protection, as Howard's tremendous quickness and leaping ability allowed him to swat plenty of shots that would have been out of reach for most centers. For this year-long effort, he was rewarded as the 2009 Defensive Player of the Year, but that was only the beginning. Over the next few seasons, Howard would continue to put up similar averages. From 2009 to 2011, he won the NBA's Defensive Player of the Year, and that 3-season streak is the longest DPOY streak in NBA history. The crazy thing is that many people believe that he should have won the award for a 4th straight season, but voter fatigue was likely a factor in why they gave the award to Tyson Chandler instead of Dwight Howard. But make no mistake, Howard had more blocks, more steals, more defensive rebounds, more defensive win shares, and a better defensive plus-minus. Regardless of the amount of awards he ended up winning, you can't really debate the fact that Howard was easily the best defensive player for an era of NBA basketball. From 2008 to 2013, Howard won a whopping 5 rebounding titles in a span of 6 years, as he was clearly the best rebounder in the game. Now here's the thing. With all of his dominance and multiple aspects, some people might start to think that Howard was a player without weakness, and arguably the best player in the game overall. Well, I would argue that he could have been, if it wasn't for one glaring weakness. Dwight was not a great scorer overall, and he was a bit limited with his post moves. The best way to defend Howard was to keep him outside of the paint, and keep his back to the basket. He wasn't a good jump shooter, he didn't have very good dribbling skills, and he really could have benefited from a better jump hook shot. These were the frequent criticisms during his career, and those critiques were not because people thought Howard was a bad player, but it was because people believed he had the potential to be the best player in the game if he expanded his scoring capabilities. Some of you might look at Howard's stats and think that these offensive criticisms are not legitimate. For example, in 2010, Howard averaged 18 points per game while leading the league in field goal percentage, hitting 61.2% of his shots. The thing is, Howard was very selective with his shooting, as he looked to score most often with his putback dunks and in pick and roll plays. But he wasn't very good at making a play for himself out of isolation situations. This is why he wasn't always aggressive on offense, and in the 2010 season, he only attempted 10.2 shots per game. LeBron, Kobe, Durant, Carmelo Anthony, and Monte Ellis all nearly attempted twice as many shots per game. Although Howard was recognized as a top 10 or even a top 5 player, he was 76th overall in total field goal attempts over the 2010 season. Even role players like Carl Landry and Corey Brewer shot the ball nearly 100 more times than Howard did over the course of the season, which really puts the criticism into perspective. So maybe he wasn't the stereotypical championship leader, But at least in the right situation, Howard could find himself on a roster where he was competing for a title as the best player on his team. He found himself in that situation in the 2009 postseason. Surrounding Dwight was an array of lethal three-point shooters who were able to alleviate most of the offensive load. Shooters like Rashard Lewis, Hedo Turkoglu, and JJ Redick. Add in two solid rotating point guards in Jameer Nelson and Rafer Alston, and it starts to make sense why this team that perfectly complemented each other made it all the way to the NBA Finals. At that point, they were clearly outgunned by the better Lakers team, as the Orlando Magic were defeated in just 5 games, and that was the closest a prime Dwight Howard would ever get to leading his team to a championship. So if I had to summarize what kind of player Dwight Howard was on the Orlando Magic, I would describe him as the player who had the talent and potential to be one of the select few greatest players of all time. But the execution limited him to being at best a top 5 player in the NBA during his prime. From an individual perspective, the 2012 to 2013 season was when Dwight's career started to head south. The Lakers shook the basketball world when they traded their championship-winning center, Andrew Bynum, for the 27-year-old superstar, Dwight Howard. The thing is, the Lakers thought they were getting an all-time great center just as he was hitting the prime of his career. But the truth is, they got him right as he was beginning his decline. You see, leading up to that offseason, Howard had major off-season back surgery, and from that point on, he never really regained his insane explosiveness from his more youthful days in Orlando. He remained a solid defender and a top rebounder for a while, but it was obvious that he lost a few steps on the athletic front. That Lakers season ended in disaster as Kobe Bryant tore his Achilles at the age of 34, and Dwight Howard ultimately decided to leave in free agency. With this, a new chapter of Dwight's career had begun, one where he had turned into a journeyman and was perceived by many as a drama queen and a locker room cancer. With that being said, Dwight remained a statistically reliable double-double player for 5 years after he left Los Angeles. At a certain point, the perception of Howard began to change, right about the same time that the expectations for him began to change. Once people started to accept that he would never be the championship leader that they thought he was capable of, and instead could embrace a role as simply a contributing complementary player on a contending team, people started to view him as a desirable player in the league. After short stints in Atlanta, Charlotte, and Washington, Dwight found his way back to Los Angeles, signing with the team in 2019. With leading stars like LeBron James and Anthony Davis on the roster, a 34-year-old Howard was able to thrive as a solid spark off the bench. His rebounding, his rim protection, and his lob finishing were all tremendously impactful bonuses for his team. As you all know, the Lakers went on to win the 2020 NBA championship, as Dwight secured his first and only championship ring of his roller coaster career. So in conclusion, just how good was Dwight Howard really? To me, he was one of the best players of his era. ESPN had the audacity to rank him as the second best player in 2011, and even then, I thought that was a little generous. But for me, he was definitely a top 5 player at his peak, who had the potential to be one of the greatest centers in basketball history. But due to his lack of solid post moves, his lack of aggression, and his inability to create his own shot, that was a potential that he simply never reached. Recently, the NBA reimagined some of their annual awards, changing the style and title of the League MVP Award to the Michael Jordan MVP Award. Along with all the various awards they recreated, they implemented a completely new one, the Jerry West Clutch Player of the Year. So seeing that the NBA has been around for over 75 years, what if we retroactively awarded these trophies to the most clutch player from each season? Who would the winners be, and how would it affect their legacies? Today, I'll do my best to answer that. The decade we're looking at in this video is the 2000s, and let me know in a comment if you agree or disagree with these choices. Starting the list with the year 2000, my first Clutch Player Award winner is none other than half man, half amazing Vince Carter. This was essentially Vince Carter's peak in terms of his popularity, as he dominated this season's NBA dunk contest, providing some of the most iconic moments of basketball history. The thing that many people forget is that not only was Carter a legit superstar, but during his prime, he was consistently one of the most clutch players in the entire league, which was frequently drawing comparisons to Michael Jordan. Two of Carter's biggest moments this year were his game-winning buzzer beaters. One was an incredibly tough shot to defeat the Celtics in Boston, and the other was this dagger three-pointer to defeat the Clippers by 1 point. But along with those was a plethora of huge go-ahead baskets in fourth quarters. Carter was also second in the league in points scored in the fourth quarter, trailing only Shaquille O'Neal. When you only have a few seconds left and you need a guy who can hit a shot from just about anywhere, a prime Vince Carter is never a bad choice. Winning the Clutch Player Award in the 2000 to 2001 season is none other than the answer, Allen Iverson. Not only was Iverson famously awarded with that season's MVP, but I also believe that he was unquestionably the most clutch player that season, as he was repeatedly providing late-game heroics for a 76ers team that didn't have many offensive weapons. His clutch performances were certainly needed, as his 76ers were 14-7 in games decided by 5 points or less. Iverson led all players that season in fourth quarter scoring, and remarkably, he improved all of his efficiency splits when playing in the fourth quarter compared to the rest of the game. Winning the award in 2002 is the man known as the Truth, Paul Pierce. There is definitely an argument to be had for other stars like Kobe Bryant, Tracy McGrady, and Allen Iverson. But this was the greatest scoring season of Pierce's career, and it was also one of the biggest years for delivering when his team needed it the most. Pierce was second overall in the entire league in fourth quarter scoring, and the only player who finished ahead of him was the 76ers' Allen Iverson. But Iverson also played 22 less games than Pierce, which helped give the Celtics legend the edge. He also hit numerous big baskets, including a game-winning buzzer beater over the Miami Heat. In 2003, the award goes to a thriving Kobe Bryant, who had his best year to date. In a season where Shaquille O'Neal struggled with injuries, Bryant was forced to pick up the load offensively, and he did just that, as he averaged over 40 points throughout the entire month of January. Kobe was second overall in fourth quarter scoring and hit numerous clutch baskets as he always does, keeping the Lakers in games that would have otherwise slipped away. Highlighting the Mamba's clutch season was this buzzer-beating game-winning basket over the Memphis Grizzlies. In 2004, Kobe Bryant yet again wins the Clutch Player Award. It wasn't necessarily one of the Mamba's better seasons statistically, as he was constantly traveling to make his court hearing dates for his famous Colorado trial. With that being said, this season provided some of the greatest late-game heroics that we had ever seen from the Mamba. The most memorable moments was Kobe's game-winning buzzer beater over the Denver Nuggets, which he then topped with his finale in the last game of the regular season, where he made one of the most difficult shots of the decade to send it to overtime. And then he hit his absurd Rainbow 3 to defeat the Blazers at the buzzer and win the division for Los Angeles. Along with all of those iconic moments, Kobe also led all players in fourth quarter scoring, and frankly, it wasn't all that close. In 2005, a still lethal Allen Iverson consistently demonstrated his clutch gene, which earns him that season's award. You certainly have to give a shout out to the Rockets' Tracy McGrady, who achieved arguably the most clutch comeback in NBA history, as he scored 13 points in 35 seconds to defeat the extremely strong San Antonio Spurs. The thing is, Iverson was more consistent in terms of the clutch factor this season, as he made 5 out of his 7 game-winning baskets he attempted that year. Not only was Iverson that season's leading scorer, but he was also second overall in fourth quarter scoring, trailing only Kobe Bryant, who was basically stat padding on a Lakers team who missed the playoffs by a mile. The player winning the award in 2006 may come as a surprise to some of you, but is actually the Denver Nuggets' Carmelo Anthony. When we think of the 2006 season, everyone of course thinks of Kobe Bryant, as he famously averaged 35 points, dropped 62 in 3 quarters, and 81 points in a game, while carrying a lackluster Lakers squad to the playoffs. Although Kobe filled up the stat sheet through all 4 quarters, no one was finishing games with big buckets more consistently than Carmelo Anthony, as the young star was legitimately in the conversation for the most clutch player in the entire league. In situations where there was no more than 24 seconds left in the game and the teams were separated by 2 points or less, Carmelo hit a ridiculous 7 out of his 10 shots that season. Not only was he not afraid of the moment, but no one, including Bryant, was coming through as reliably as Melo was that year. Winning the award in 2007 is a player that many often overlook, the Wizards assassin Gilbert Arenas. This was one of the most impressive scoring seasons of Gilbert's career, as there was basically nowhere on the court where he wasn't a threat. The signature matchup of his season was when he dropped 60 points on Kobe and the Lakers in Los Angeles. Not only did he outshine the Mamba in one of the all-time great solo battles, but Arenas was certainly the more clutch player, as he dropped an absurd 31 points between the 4th quarter and overtime. Arenas also had several clutch buzzer beaters, including this pull-up 3 to beat Milwaukee and this deep sniper shot to beat Utah. These are just a few of his dagger jumpers that made the difference that season. This perfectly summed up Gilbert's prime, as he was a high-scoring, deep-shooting, clutch-as-it-gets marksman. Winning the award in 2008 for the first time, but probably not his last, is the man they call the King, LeBron James. 2008 was Kobe's time to win his first League MVP award, but it probably wasn't his most clutch season, as the newly acquired Pau Gasol led to many easy blowout victories for the Lakers. On the other hand, LeBron had to carry his Cleveland Cavaliers, especially in 4th quarters. James averaged a massive 9.1 points in the 4th throughout the season. Not only did that lead all players that year, but that was the second highest average of the entire decade. Along with that, LeBron led all players in field goals made in situations where there was no more than 24 seconds left in the game and the teams were separated by 2 points or less. He had the numbers, he carried the team, and he hit more big shots than anyone else, which is why LeBron is taking home the award for 08. In what may be a surprise to some, but not to anyone who watched him play, Brandon Roy is taking home the Clutch Player Award for 2009. At the time, Roy was one of the most dangerous isolation players in the game, and he had a serious clutch gene. By the time the regular season was over, Roy made over 25 shots with less than 35 seconds left in the game that either tied the game or gave his team the lead. He was ranked 6th overall in 4th quarter scoring, but among the players in the top 10, he was easily the most efficient, as he shot 50.5% from the field and 44.3% from 3-point range in the 4th quarter. He had many game winners that season, but none were more iconic than his buzzer-beating 3 to beat the Houston Rockets. Clutch performances like this were a huge reason why Kobe Bryant once said that Brandon Roy was the hardest player to guard in the entire Western Conference.
So I gotta be real with you guys. I already know today's video is going to be extremely triggering to a large demographic of my audience. For the most part, I don't consider myself an NBA YouTuber, but an NBA history YouTuber. My specialty is covering eras from generations past. I choose to cover these past eras more than the modern era, not because I'm biased towards older basketball, and not because those eras contain some of my favorite players. The reason I do it is because I believe it's the best thing I have to offer. Most YouTubers who cover this sport are much younger than me and haven't been watching the game as long, which naturally means that the modern coverage of the NBA is way more saturated. With each video I upload, I hope that there is something new that the audience can learn from it. If you watch my video and you discover something new and interesting about the game of basketball, then I believe I'm doing my job well. This is why I disproportionately talk about the past generations more. With this being the case, my average viewer tends to be much older than the average basketball viewer. You fellow old heads are the lifeblood of my channel. I am eternally grateful for you guys, because I know for a fact that my channel wouldn't be nearly as successful if it wasn't for you guys consistently tuning in. With that being said, I tried to be as impartial as possible with my basketball opinions. So because of that, I have to risk pissing some of you off today. As the title of this video indicates, I firmly believe that this modern era is the most overall talented league in the history of the NBA. For a while, I debated between several different eras. The NBA around 1988, around 1992, and around the early 2000s were ridiculously dense with superstar talent. And maybe in a future video, I'll break down the comparisons even more. But as of now, 2023 stands on top. There's several reasons for this. The first major reason is because there's a tremendous amount of talent league-wide with more teams. Throughout the decade of the 1960s, there was usually about 8 to 12 teams in the entire league. Although the late 1980s were extremely rich in depth, there was still only 20 to 24 teams in the league. The late 90s of the NBA are often referred to as the expansion era because there were numerous teams being added to the competition during those years. If we're being honest, it took a while for the talent in the league to catch up with the amount of teams it had. Whenever teams are added, the talent pool immediately becomes less concentrated, naturally diminishing formidability of the average NBA team. With the league comfortably sitting at 30 teams since the year 2004, there has been plenty of time for the sport to acquire worldwide talent to fit the amount of franchises. Now, my second major reason why this is the most talented era ever is because the rest of the world is better at the game of basketball than they've ever been before. And those top-tier international players almost all represent the NBA. With guys in the league like Giannis, Luka, Jokic, and Embiid, this is probably the first era in NBA history that the top 5 players in the league were mostly made up of international players. It's not just the foreign superstars though, but from the top to the bottom of NBA rosters, we're seeing more capable role players from all over the world. And it's because, on a global scale, the popularity of the game is growing at a rapid rate. No, it's not that the American talent has dropped off, but it's that the international talent has caught up. And some would even suggest that it has surpassed the US in talent. Along with the international talent in the NBA, the Olympic and the FIBA USA teams have been progressively finding it harder and harder to win gold medals throughout the decades. Obviously, it would help the red, white, and blue's chances if they always put their best foot forward and send out the A team for these international competitions. But regardless, the days of the US being able to cruise to a gold medal with simply the B team are long behind us. The third reason why this is the most talented era ever is because in reality, there's several different eras packed into it. For those of you who are old enough, remember those old Energizer battery commercials where the Energizer Bunny was powered by their batteries up against the generic competitors, and the bunny would always win because it just kept going and going and going? Well, the modern athlete is the Energizer Bunny. This isn't just my opinion, but statistically, this is an objective fact. Of the first round of the 1970 NBA draft, the players selected played for an average of 6.4 years. From the 1980 draft, they played for an average of 7 years. From 1990, they played for an average of 8.4 years. And from the 2000 draft, they played for an average of 9 years. Now obviously, I can't gather the data from a decade later, because many of those players are still playing, but I guarantee you that it will be another significant jump. Not just in the NBA, but in basically every sport, athletes are lasting longer than ever before. You have a guy like LeBron James, who's in his 21st season in the NBA and is still considered by many as a top 10 player. Guys like Steph Curry and Kevin Durant are quickly approaching their late 30s and are considered by many to be top 5 players in the league. These guys are just additional superstars to the guys who are in their early 30s and their 20s. If we're looking at NBA history as an indicator, players like LeBron, Steph, and Durant are not supposed to be among the top 10 players in this era. Some of these guys were in the best player conversation in the 2000s. I'm not sure all of you guys are getting my point, so let me put it this way. Guys like Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Isaiah Thomas dominated the 1980s, but on average, their careers only lasted about 11 to 13 seasons. Now imagine if these legends remained among the best players in the NBA until their late 30s. If that was the case, the mid to late 1990s would have been absurdly packed with talent at the top. Envision a league with a prime Michael Jordan, Hakeem Olajuwon, David Robinson, Shaquille O'Neal, Grant Hill, Penny Hardaway, Patrick Ewing, and then you throw in Magic, Bird, and Isaiah pretty damn close to their peaks. If that hypothetical league blows your mind, then you should begin to understand my point. That is exactly the kind of league we're in today. Now, as far as the reasons for this, those are debatable. Some will give the credit to modern medicine. Some will give the credit to advanced technology and training methods. Some will give credit to the better shoes and the private planes. Hell, some will even go as far as crediting the load management. And some, with the more spicy takes, might suggest that it's because all of the designer drugs that the league isn't tracking. Whatever the main culprit is, it's simply undeniable. Players are finding ways to extend their primes well beyond what is the typical standard of basketball history. And due to this, we now have this wild league, where players from the 2003 draft class, the 2013 draft class, and the 2023 draft class are all fighting for basketball supremacy. Whether it's the toughest league or the most entertaining league are different conversations entirely that will simply have to wait for a future video. But as far as the most talented era of basketball history, we're living it, and it's getting to the point where it won't even be all that close. In the last few years, it's become incredibly popular to talk about times where a player was offended, and then he went out and did something remarkable on the court in response. Two of the most obvious players you hear this frequently about are Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant. With that being said, players have been taking things personally and using it as motivation, going all the way back to the early days of the league. Today, I have a story about the greatest winner in NBA history, in an instance where he took something personally and went out and achieved history in response. Now, as most of us all know, Bill Russell has more rings than fingers, as he won 11 championships throughout his NBA career. His Celtics dominated the 1960s like no team has ever dominated the league before or since. At one point, Boston had won 8 consecutive NBA titles, as they became the model of excellence within the game of basketball. It's easy to simply look upon that great success on a surface level, and just assume that the Celtics steamrolled the league as juggernauts and were never considered as underdogs during that winning era. But that's actually not the case at all. We pick up our story at the end of the 1967-68 season. It's the NBA Finals between Bill Russell and the Boston Celtics, and Jerry West and Elgin Baylor of the Los Angeles Lakers. Since Bill Russell was drafted, this was the 6th time that the Lakers and Celtics met up in the NBA Finals, and each and every one of those times, the Celtics had won the championship. Boston had an absolute stranglehold on this series, but that didn't mean that it didn't feel like the tides were changing. Although there was a gap between the Celtics and Lakers, the gap was closing, and it was closing fast. Bill Russell was just reaching his mid-30s, and the rumors of his eventual retirement were now fully underway. On the other hand, the Lakers were a much younger team, and their best player, Jerry West, was just reaching the prime of his career. After years of crushing the regular season, regularly finishing around 60 wins, Boston had slowed down a bit, and in the 1967-68 regular season, they finished with a 54-28 record, which was only slightly better than the Lakers' 52-30 record. Heading into the 1968 NBA Finals, people were expecting this matchup to be far more competitive than it typically was, and that's exactly what happened. Bill Russell and the Celtics eventually went on to beat these Lakers in 6 games, but it wasn't an easy 6-game series, as the average margin of victory was only 1.5 points per game. As optimistic as the Lakers felt heading into that postseason, they ultimately left the 68 Finals hanging their heads in failure, as they were now 0-6 against Bill Russell's Celtics. With that being said, their confidence would be restored in that upcoming offseason, and in a powerful way. On July 9th, 1968, the Lakers achieved one of the greatest and most lopsided trades in NBA history. The Lakers had acquired Wilt Chamberlain from the Philadelphia 76ers in exchange for Darrell Imhoff, Archie Clark, and Jerry Chambers.
What Los Angeles was adding to their already powerful roster was a superstar center who had just led his team to a championship in 1967. Now the Lakers had star power that absolutely no one could match on paper. Jerry West and Elgin Baylor were each annual MVP contenders, and Wilt Chamberlain was simply the most statistically dominant player in the history of the game. This was the first time in basketball history that a team was widely being referred to as a super team. The Lakers had already believed that they were preparing to take the torch from the Celtics, but now they believed they were going to do it with overwhelming force. In the media, the narrative was that the age of the Celtics was over. The time of the Lakers had come. The hype was intense, as Los Angeles packed out their first preseason game with an attendance of 12,443 fans, which at the time was the largest basketball crowd that the city of Los Angeles had ever seen. Energized by their new superstar and by their resurrected confidence, the Lakers dominated the regular season, finishing with the best record in the Western Conference. On the other hand, the Boston Celtics were beginning to show their age, and were struggling to a greater extent than they were accustomed to. They finished the regular season with only a 48-34 record, which was the only time during the decade that they finished below 50 wins. At this point in basketball history, only 8 teams made it to the NBA playoffs, which means that these 4th-seeded Celtics barely made the cut. Heading into these playoffs, it appeared to be clear to everyone that the super team Lakers were the team to beat. Despite their mediocre regular season showing, the Celtics hit the switch in the playoffs, tapping into their experience and maturity, as they defeated the 55-win 76ers in 5 games, and then they defeated the 54-win Knicks in 6 games. This set up yet another epic finals matchup between the historic rivals, the Lakers and the Celtics. Now before this, the Lakers and Celtics had met up 6 times in the regular season, and the Lakers won 4 out of those 6 matchups, with the last victory for Los Angeles being a 35-point beatdown in Boston Garden, which took place roughly a week before the playoffs were set to begin. So not only did the Lakers have a better record, and not only were they clearly the more talented team on paper, but they had also been abusing the Celtics all season long. All signs were pointing to this year being a coronation for LA. Of course, some people believe the Celtics would find a way to win yet again, because that's what they always seem to do. But all conventional evidence was pointing to the rise of a new power in the league. When the finals began, things proceeded to go exactly as expected, as the Lakers' Big Three dominated Game 1, scoring 92 points combined between their three-headed monster. After 2 games, the Lakers were in a commanding position, leading the series 2-0. With that being said, Bill Russell and John Havlicek always performed with elite desperation when their backs were against the wall. At the end of Game 6, Boston had successfully done the unthinkable and forced an improbable Game 7 in Los Angeles. Now here's the thing. Heading into Game 7, 3 games had been played in Los Angeles, and 3 games had been played in Boston. The Lakers had won all 3 games in LA, while the Celtics won all 3 games in Boston. With Game 7 being held in the Forum in Los Angeles, the Lakers had every reason to be extremely confident that they were going to win the championship and finally put an end to the Celtics' reign over the league. The one person who led that confident charge for the Lakers organization was the Lakers owner, Jack Kent Cooke. With supreme conviction that his team was going to win Game 7, Jack made celebration plans for as soon as the Lakers hypothetically won the game, and he made these plans public to everyone. Jack made sure that a flyer was placed on each and every spectator's seat prior to the game, and on the flyer it said, "When, not if, the Lakers win the title, balloons will be released from the rafters, the USC marching band will play Happy Days Are Here again, and broadcaster Chick Hearn will interview Elgin Baylor, Jerry West, and Wilt Chamberlain in that order." Now these balloons were being held in the rafters with the giant net, and printed onto each of these balloons was the words "World Champion Lakers." These balloons could be seen easily by everyone on the basketball court. Before tip-off, word reached the Celtics locker room about the Lakers' arrogant celebration plans, and obviously, as competitors, the Celtics players were extremely infuriated. and none of them were more angry than the Celtics leader, Bill Russell. During the pregame shoot-around, the Celtics could see the balloons as they were practicing. Soon afterwards, the star players met up at center court, which is customary prior to the start of a championship game. When Jerry West and Bill Russell came face to face with one another, Russell looked directly at him and said, "Those f***ing balloons are staying up there." The challenge had been made and the table was set. Tip-off took place, and what ensued was one of the greatest games in the history of the NBA. Jerry West did his part, putting up a 40-point triple-double. Wilt Chamberlain also showed up with a monstrous effort, but an untimely injury forced him to miss the final minutes of an extremely close contest. Although the Celtics were up by as many as 17 points in the fourth quarter, Los Angeles stormed back to make the game a nail-biter in the final minutes. But that's when Bill Russell came through and fulfilled his promise. On the night, Russell had 6 points, 21 rebounds, and 6 assists. He led all Celtics players in minutes, rebounds, assists, and presumably blocks, as his key rebounds and defensive stops were the major difference maker down the stretch. When the buzzer sounded, the Celtics had done it yet again, as they defeated the Lakers for the 7th time in the NBA Finals. Bill Russell now had 11 championship rings, and this victory made him 10-0 in deciding 7th games. And, of course, those balloons did in fact stay up there. If there's one thing to learn from this video, is that you never, ever bet against Bill Russell in the NBA Finals, especially in a Game 7, regardless of the opposition and regardless of the odds. So what do you guys think? What's your favorite story about a player taking something personally? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments section below. Thanks for watching as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.